Hello everyone, and welcome to the next supercut of a already previously completed retrospective on OAM. Now this is a compilation of my Ergo Proxy series with a few extra tidbits added in. For the structure of this retrospective, we're going to look at the plot, and then the setting, and then a character, a theme, character, theme, until we reach the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoy, and please forgive some audio inconsistencies, as these were made before I kind of standardized my setup, so there might be a little audio unevenness here and again, which I'll try to fix or even perhaps re-record the worst bits in post. Thank you, and please enjoy. We will now be looking at Ergo Proxy, a somewhat polarizing and complicated piece to say the least, which seems to lack a very clear consensus, or a general consensus of it. I've heard it described as both one of the most thoughtful and deep animes of all time, to the most pretentious production of all time and a waste of complete effort. Now, of course, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but such a wide range of them, of course, piqued my interest. Now, Ergo Proxy is the first series we will review that I don't have any childhood memories of. In fact, I first watched it as an adult, after I saw it listed next to Technolize under as similar. Seeing this, of course, and the description of being the most pretentious thing ever, I was of course curious. But before we get any deeper into this review, I will of course answer the question, do I like Ergo Proxy? The answer, of course, is yes, though I will admit, perhaps not in the way intended, and I might be watching it wrong. Now, of course, I'll get more into that later. And while we will explore the themes of this series later in the theme component of the retrospective, I just wanted to preference this review by saying that this show does love its themes and philosophy and philosophers, and leans very heavily on them from time to time. And this can be a turn-off for some, especially considering how densely Ergo Proxy is packaged with them. I will also preference this review by saying that while we may talk about and look at some of the philosophers' ideas for the sake of understanding writing direction, production decisions, and themes present, I have no intention of doing an in-depth breakdown of entire schools of thought, as I find it beyond the scope of this video, and frankly, I don't really think you need to understand the entirety of, like, Nietzsche or Lacan or anyone else mentioned to fully appreciate Ergo Proxy. While this knowledge of course does help understanding the show, I feel the show can stand on its own. And I feel this also gets rid of the criticism that you need to know a lot about philosophy to understand the show. You don't really. The show is a good show. And even if you don't necessarily understand all the topics at hand, you will enjoy it as long as you pay attention. Although I do understand with how densely everything's packaged in there, it can be hard to pay attention from time to time. Anyways, I have no intentions of doing any in-depth philosophy breakdowns. Sorry for anyone that might have liked that. I'm simply some guy, and I'm simply here to talk about a great show, and what I observed about it, and what I really liked about it. Now, what I mean by all of this is that Ergo Proxy is a story with quite a few moving parts, themes, and one which very openly dives into its love of philosophy and philosophers at will and at times randomly. And for this reason, the series can seem very daunting at first. Now, there were times, I will admit, I did have to rewatch a couple of scenes 3 or 4 times, just to absorb everything, get all those details in my brain, push it deep into my memory folds. And I can see how that's frustrating for someone who just wants to get to the plot, or doesn't feel like rewinding constantly, or doesn't want to have so much going on at once. I understand, you watch your shows to relax. And I did find Ergo Proxy relaxing, but I also found it to be very mentally engaging. If you're coming back after a long day at work, I can understand if, that's not what you want to do. I understand why some might not like this show for that reason. It is quite dense sometimes, as it does demand you pay 100% attention to it and its details. Most 100% of the time. For this reason, though, I feel like watching Ergo Proxy is more like riding a wave than, driving a car or something. And this is where I was getting to how I, quote, might have watched it wrong. You see, when you're in a car, or you're driving a car, you're in control. You decide how fast you're going, what direction you turn, where you're going, you're in control. With a wave, however, it's gonna swamp you if you fight it. You just gotta go with it and see where it takes you. And that's how I watched Ergo Proxy. I watched it as you would watch a wave. Now, I did understand some of the higher concepts, some of the higher ideas right off the bat. I was familiar with the idea of Gnosticism, and some of the philosophical stuff hinted at I was familiar with, but there was some stuff which I will admit completely went over my head, some stuff which I still don't quite understand after rewatching. I had to rewatch some stuff, several times, as mentioned earlier, to make sure I got most of it, though I did understand the plot. And again, you don't necessarily need to know all the philosophy stuff to get the plot, so I feel like I was in a good middle ground to write this review. And even as a normal guy with, pretty average IQ, and someone who wasn't entirely sure about all of the higher thought going on into this show. You know, even with all the moving parts and all that in mind, I still very much enjoyed it. You see, you don't need a PhD in philosophy to understand the plot of Ergo Proxy. And as long as you pay attention, you'll be okay. You got this. Even if some of the ideas do go over your head, or at least in my experiences. In fact, I found it to be very engaging, both directly and indirectly. Direct engagement, of course, is when the show would directly postulate a question for you and you said, I wonder if that's true, or I wonder what I would do. This is when it directly asks you and engages your brain. And even if I had to pause for a bit at times, to think about stuff, I did like how engaged my brain was. And, it did keep me involved. I never got bored with the show, I'll say that. Other times, the indirect engagement would take over, and, the show would talk, or, show some big scene or whatever, and it would allow you and encourage you, or at least me, to pick up, subtle details, and be like, oh, look, that's in that frame, I wonder if that's connected to that, and you would, subtly get world building and subtle themes in there. There were parts where I felt like I was watching two people debate, but I never felt like I was being talked down to, which is another thing people don't like about the show. Sometimes I've heard some people say that it feels like it's talking down to them. If anything, I feel like Ergo Proxy has the problem of assuming the viewer knows too much. I feel it has the opposite problem sometimes. They'll just throw stuff around and be like, oh yeah, you know that, and I'm like, I don't. The show is neither 100% lecture or 100% word search, and alternating between the two prevented me from getting any kind of mental fatigue. In fact, I watched all 23 episodes in just 2 sittings, and I was engaged the whole time. I never got bored. And all of this, of course, is tied together by amazing atmosphere and setting, well fleshed out characters, and an engaging mystery plot. Now, on the topic of the plot, the actual focal point of this episode, now that the introduction is done, let's look at how the plot factors into the series. Now, Ergo Proxy moves a bit fast, and there's a lot of moving parts, so I may cut out a lot, but I'm just trying to get the bare bones plot summary down. Again, I don't want to spoil the series too much. I do recommend watching it. So let's just get right into it. I apologize if I get these slightly out of order or if I forget something. Ergo Proxy also likes to open in the middle of sequences, so just so you know, a lot of stuff won't make sense till later in an episode. And I mention that because that's how episode 1 starts. They throw you right in. Episode 1 opens with a monster, known as a proxy, escaping from a lab, somewhere in a city. From here, the plot now follows Raul Mayer, known as Lil in the Japanese version, who is an investigator in the domed city of Rondau, investigating several bizarre murders. Now, Rondau, I'm going to mispronounce that word many times, is a domed city, and it's domed because a massive methane explosion destroyed the environment and killed 85% of life on Earth several hundred years prior. Now, all of humanity either lives in domed cities or colony ships orbiting the planet, waiting for the environment to heal. Anyways, Raul first thinks that the murders are done by autorevs, this universe's androids, infected by the Cogito virus, which gives androids full sentience and a soul. This introduces Vincent Law, a timid immigrant who works destroying infecting autorevs. Raul soon learns that this is probably not the case, however, as a monster with superhuman speed and strength attacks her while she investigates a building. Now, this monster, also a proxy, later attacks her at her home and warns her of the awakening, only to be attacked by a proxy from the beginning of the episode. I.e. a proxy came to her house and a different one fought it off. When Raul reports this, she finds that she's been taken off the case, and it's very obvious the city government is trying to censor her, keep her off the big picture. They try to frame Vincent for the attack. She's smart enough not to believe this, though. She's very smart, and it's very obvious they're trying to lie. And meanwhile, the escaped proxy tries to kill Vincent, and somehow it ends up dead itself. More on that later. Anyways, the Security Bureau, under the control of Raul Creed, spelled Raul, starts a manhunt to persecute Vincent and wrap the whole affair up. Riel now sees Vincent as the answer to her questions about the proxy and the attack. And she finds him as he tries to escape the dome with Pino, an auto-rave of a young girl now with a soul. When Riel finds Vincent, so does Raul, and Vincent and Pino end up jumping out of an airlock to escape. Now the two survive, and they live in a commune outside the dome for a bit, until Riel comes to take Vincent back, only to fall sick from the outside air, and ends up being carried back by Hootie, the commune leader. Raul next burns down the commune, and Vincent escapes on the Sensun, this here ship, to discover the past, his past, which he hopes to do so by returning to his original home city of Mosque. He hopes that this will restore his memories and answer the questions burning away at him, as by now it's obvious that he's struggling with something. Along the way, Vincent meets fellow proxies and learns that he himself is a proxy, Ergo Proxy, Agent of Death, and that he holds great power, which he slowly learns to control. Meanwhile, back in Rondau, Riel is now in hot water, and a failed assassination attempt allows her to fake her death and run away and try and catch another proxy, and find Vincent to answer her questions. She escapes with the help of Dr. Daedalus, a creepy young man who seems to have a bizarre obsession about her. More about that later. who gives her bullets which can kill a proxy. In return, Daedalus asks for a proxy to be brought back to him, so he can continue his research. Riel and her auto-rev Iggy, now with Cognito virus, eventually run into Vincent and kill a proxy, which Iggy is instructed to bring back alone. Iggy, with Cognito, and upset with Riel's refusal to return, with her refusal to simply get back to comfortable things, with her refusal to abandon her quest for truth, gets annoyed and, almost gets everyone killed. He does get killed. And this quite shakes Riel, who now starts to learn the importance of putting values on others. Riel now joins Vincent and Pino on the Sensun, and the three form a sort of family as they adventure to Mosque. Along the way, Riel shows a lot of character growth, growing markedly more caring and patient, and Vincent slowly learns about his proxy past and powers. While they're on their quest, however, Raul, still in Ramdao, grows frustrated with the constraints placed upon him in the name of order, and slowly starts to bring down Ramdao through a series of aggressive power plays, questionable decisions, and poor judgments. More on that later. This is important. Anyways, Vincent and crew finally make it to a bombed-out mosque, where they find the memory room, which Vincent, he can't read, but it does tell him to go back to Ramdao, and they figure that even if this is the only thing they learned, it does show them all that that's where their destination is, where their true fate lies. The three make it back to Ramdao, and Vincent goes full proxy, disappearing for a few days, exploring the dome, while Riel tries to establish what's happening. She learns that Vincent is the proxy which created Ramdao. Each dome city had its own proxy that they needed to sustain the functions of the city, and that he had left decades earlier as he, quote, wanted to escape his imperfections. Anyways, now in this hellscape, as mentioned earlier, caused by many poor decisions on Raul's part, Raul is consumed with his quest to kill Vincent. He fails, however, and ends up killed by a clone of the original proxy, Monad, that's the proxy, made by Daedalus. Also, for some reason, he made it to look like Riel, and he, over the course of the past 10 episodes, has slowly been going down the mental health hill. He is not healthy by this point in time. Just remember that. Things come to a head in the Room of the Regent, where Riel announces that she has come to her own truth, and now knows that there is one behind the Regent, and even the creator of Ramdao, Vincent. And the one behind Vincent is Proxy 1. Now, Proxy 1 is first mentioned or hinted at in episode 15, although doesn't appear in person until the last episode, which is kind of a deus ex machina, although I feel like this was intentionally done in line with the philosophical, beliefs of the show, and I do understand why people criticize that. Now, this Proxy 1 made Vincent, who was a clone of him, and he made Vincent so that someone could understand the pain of being an unloved creator. This ties into Gnosticism, which, again, will get its own video later. Proxy 1 wanted Vincent to team up with him to destroy everything and stick it to Proxy 1's creator. You see, the proxies were originally made to save mankind by fueling the domes long enough to outlast the apocalypse, and then once the environment was good again, natural sunlight would filter into the domes and kill the proxies, as they can't live in sun, and this would see man reestablish itself on Earth. This was the awakening mentioned throughout the series. Now, Proxy 1 is frustrated by this, as it means that he is both an unloved creator and kind of, waiting to die, and for this reason made Vincent to help him on his revenge quest. And also, to stick it to the creator, Proxy 1 made Vincent immune to sunlight. Anyways, Daedalus goes insane when both Riel and the Monad clone, who looks like Riel, both see Vincent as more important than Daedalus and whatever it is he's been trying to do. And now, fully insane, Daedalus decides to initiate the self-destruct sequence of Ramdao. Before this happens, though, Vincent and Monad stop Proxy 1. Proxy 1 dies. Monad flies into the sun. Daedalus gets piped. And Riel is rescued by Pino and Christiva, Raul's auto-rev, on the Sensun. All of this happens in about 10 minutes. It was the last episode. Anyways, the show ends with the Sensun on its way to pick up Vincent, as he looks on as colony ships long in orbit descend to put humans back on Earth. With such a complicated plot, it's easy to see why I found this Ergo Proxy so engrossing, but it's also easy for me to understand why some may not like it, and I also see the origins for many of the common criticisms that this show has. These criticisms are that many episodes may seem nonsensical, the journey to Mosque is pointless, and that the ending comes out of nowhere. To quickly address these, though, I will say that with one exception, episode 20, I did not like that episode. Most of the episodes were sensical enough. While the series does like throwing the viewer right in the episodes, it usually explains everything throughout the course of the episode enough so that it makes sense by the time the episode's over. I think it just does this to try and hook viewers right away, and to be fair, it worked. There were many episodes where I said, how are they going to explain this? And then, they did. I was like, I'm impressed. That was a cool episode. And again, with one exception, which had no real bearing on the plot, I was always satisfied with how the episodes played out, even if they started off a little confusing. They usually ended up being explained to my satisfaction. Next, while the destination of Mosque may not seem to provide anything other than an order to go back to Romtau, the journey itself provided much, much more, as the experiences afforded by it see all three of the main protagonists grow by leaps and bounds. They come to be the best versions of themselves and fully mature into good characters. Vincent becomes a stronger man, now sure of himself and his powers. Raul learns the power of compassion and is, by the end of the series, a very kind and caring woman. And Pino, of course, learns to accept and embrace her soul as she becomes a true child. In this case, it truly is about the journey, and it's critical to both world building and character growth. As for the ending, well, it does come out of nowhere, and I will agree with that. However, I do respect the show for sticking to its metaphysical guns, even if it doesn't make the most literal sense. In addition, all of it is in line with the world building established up until this point, and I don't take much issue with it, as it did make enough sense for me. I will admit it did feel kind of tacked on, but it did make enough sense for me that I didn't see any big issue with it. And in all honesty, all I really needed to be happy with the ending was the implication that the young family of Raul, Vincent, and Pino would continue on. They have such a wholesome family dynamic for such an on-the-surface bleak show, and I love it. On the topic of bleak surface levels, I will say that one of the things I found most enjoyable about Ergo Proxy was how it was never as bleak as it seemed. While a lot of shows like to put on a bright veneer and then have dark undertones, Ergo Proxy does kind of the opposite. Don't get me wrong, it can be very bleak from time to time, but the messages it has are usually either good-natured warnings or surprisingly uplifting messages of encouragement. Much like the niche it draws inspiration from, I feel that Ergo Proxy is simply written off as sad, even though it isn't necessarily. It may just seem that way on the surface, but really the tale of Vincent, Raul, and Pino is anything but sad. It's the story of three young people escaping the bounds placed upon them by society to achieve their greatest forms through their own efforts and achieve enlightenment through their own efforts. In this way, it really is an inspirational story of character growth. And while the plot may be a bit muddled, life is a bit muddled. And it does see them through to become the best versions of themselves and continue their beautiful young family. And in this way, it really is a well-written homage to niche, as it may seem sad, but it's uplifting. And it also is a great, obscure anime memory. And now that the plot of the series has been discussed, let's discuss where this plot takes place. As mentioned earlier, Ergo Proxy takes place on a post-apocalyptic Earth, which has been wiped out by a massive methyl hydrate explosion several centuries earlier. Life, for the most part, has ceased on Earth, save in various small domes and scattered pockets in isolated locales, and there might be a few scavenging camps of humans roughing it in the wastes. For the most part, though, it's a barren land, which gives birth to our story. First, I'd like to briefly touch on the metaphysical settings of Ergo Proxy. Now, while some people may not like Ergo Proxy's love of dream scenes and subconscious exploration, I personally am a fan of them, as it allows the animation medium to really take charge in order to explore someone's inner thought processes and feelings. It's a good way to let us get to know characters without necessarily having to be told how they feel. In addition, it also adds to the suspense and tension elements and the surreal element present throughout most of the show. Now, the physical settings in Ergo Proxy generally fall into two very opposite categories. They are either eerily pristine domes, which can be seen with the white color palette, the lack of grit present, and the fact that they seem oddly planned out, very symmetrical and very artificial creations, whether they have or have not humans. The other settings that this series takes place in are wastelands in various states of decay and reclamation by nature. These can be failed domes, these can be barren salt flats, these could be windy mountains, anything really, and these scenes are always portrayed in dark and grim tones, showing that everything is dead. These two color palettes are very different, but they also convey an idea of death, and I'll get more onto that later. Now, these are very different contradicting settings as well, and for this video we'll start with the former. Now, the dome settlements, still in good shape, seem to be human havens. They're intended to be small paradises coddling the human race until it's safe to go outside again. On the surface, they're pristine, safe, and technological marvels, shielding humanity and ensuring that all will go smoothly. On the other hand, though, if one looks a little deeper, it's obvious they're a little too orderly. They're obviously not natural constructions. They're monuments to the ability of man to defy nature and go against it. They are sterile, strict, and quiet. Their white walls seem not only to strangle any germs, but any kind of creative or questioning thought. While they keep man safe, they also keep him in the dark and isolate him in a sort of false womb. And this is just where the domes went according to plan. In many domes, it goes even worse. so as the proxies of those domes may not necessarily care for people. Take the robot dome shown in episode 10, which is a world with no humans kept pristine by pre-programmed automatons. Or worse, take the domes of Ophelia, or say Smileland, which saw their inhabitants either killed or pseudo-enslaved by their proxies, as a result of their proxies' own flaws. Now it's obvious that not every dome went well, as not every proxy necessarily cared for their inhabitants or their job. With this in mind, say we wanted to leave the domes, well, what would we find then? In that case, we would find a sprawling waste littered with failed domes, mountainous traverses, and dangers galore. To start, the very air is poisonous enough to kill about 80% of people who just breathe it in. Those that do survive would be left to wander aimlessly and either die of starvation, or hope to find some kind of dome or settlement to take them in, or to scavenge from. While it is a bleak waste, not all life here is dead. There does seem to be some forests and plants in certain areas, and a lucky traveler could hypothetically bounce between domes on their journey. Now these are the two kinds of settings in Ergo Proxy, and they both play off of each other perfectly to set up the quintessential post-apocalyptic dome world, and the consequences of living in it. They are both two sides of the same coin, that being the stagnation of humanity and its dire situation in a ruined world. The outside world shows the obvious death of the world. One racked by environmental disaster and destruction, a land where nothing can really live, and where the gray soil harbors nothing but failure, where people haven't been around for a while. While one may be free to do as they please here, their physical constraints placed upon them here would likely prevent them from doing anything for too long. It's a land of physical and natural death. We see this in the gray color palette, and the fact that there's no plant life almost anywhere. This gray skies and the gray color palette could portray nothing but death. Nothing can live here physically. The domes, on the other hand, represent a kind of spiritual, mental form of death, however. As mentioned earlier, the things which make them comfortable technological marvels also make them suffocating cradles. Such a lax and sterile environment creates a society where no one really cares about or thinks about anything really, and humanity slowly loses its natural edge and drive. While humans populate these domes, no one really lives in them. In fact, the humans themselves have been said to have lost the ability to procreate, and are more of automatons carrying out the functions for the dome. In an odd way, it's more like the people exist to serve the dome than the dome exists to serve the people, as they have been reduced to cogs in a machine, run by computers and sterile logic. Adding to the sense of strangulating stagnation upheld by technological advance is the world-building facets of these domes. The auto-revs and the womb-sys. Now, auto-revs, of course, are the androids of this world, and Romdow's people are extremely dependent on them, to the point of not being able to do basic functions without them. Check out this guy. He doesn't even know he's not on a computer, because his auto-rev didn't tell him. Even more critical, though, is the womb-sys, or the womb room as I refer to it, a tube-like structure through which more people are grown. Now, in this world, again, it's been said that people don't think they can procreate naturally. As such, the womb-sys is a workaround for this to be able to create more people. However, as stated, people are grown not necessarily because people want families or experience humanity, but because the dome needs more people to fill certain roles. In Romdow, the people need technology to even procreate. They also need government permission. And this adds another dreadful thread to the smothering blanket of the setting. Romdow is a city stuck in the hell of bureaucracy, and all of its accompanying issues. There's constant governmental squabbling, and yet also constant control. The people here are not really respected by their government, and instead are simply encouraged to lose themselves in a miasma of consumerism and not questioning, and ignorance, and thus continue the cycle of stagnation. Adding to the idea that Romdow is a bureaucratic hellscape is the throne room, or the regent's room, which is one of the only areas in the city which doesn't use the already mentioned gray or white color scheme. It's instead a somber and earthly brown tone, and this is important because it distinguishes it from the rest of the dome. It also helps lend to the somber and oppressive atmosphere about it. Note how there's bars separating the regent from his people. Note how there's statues, which I believe are computers, which in turn dictate to the people. Note how whenever someone has to go there, they sit in a small chair or stand at the far end and are dictated to. It helps convey the oppressive atmosphere of Romdow itself, and indeed its oppressive bureaucracy. It shows a people separated from their government, and a government set apart from the higher principles which originally founded it, or at least seemingly founded it. It sets forward an idea of a people truly lost and stray, in a lost world. Its heavy religious presence, or at least pseudo-religious presence and air, also lend to the idea of how unnatural Romdow is, as supposedly this is the highest and most important room of the city, yet it feels oddly unnatural, and seemingly quite far from any higher creator, as it seems nothing more than the brain of a body slowly dying of stagnation, separated from normal life and life procedures, something which in itself is not natural. The dome cities are just another form of slow death, like the outside. and we can see this with their bright white color palettes. Now, while this color may be connected with the idea of cleanliness, it's also connected with the concept of sterility. And sterility basically means the death of small organisms. And now, while humans are not necessarily small organisms, we're made of very small organisms. Cells are the building blocks of life. Cells can be argued to be life itself. Therefore, if sterility seeks to kill cells, we can also see that the sterile color palette represents a different sort of death, and that the humans here are also living in a kind of half-alive state. Now, these two very different settings also complete two very different objectives. On the surface level, they set up the world as very bleak and depressing, where many things have gone wrong and where things can get even worse at any second. They serve to ground the series and feed into a sense of suspense and dread, which rope the viewer in. Everything is somehow unnatural, regardless of what setting type it is, and this uncanny factor tells us that this is a world in which something is very wrong, and that humanity may not necessarily have much of a place for much longer. Even the writing direction of the show feeds into this setting, as all the philosophical thought flowing about and around in various episodes add a sort of Lovecraftian horror to it, a sort of fear of the incomprehensible. This is also aided by the fact that episodes often start halfway through, which add to the eerie air present and the fear of not understanding, or the tenseness caused by this. In line with this sense of creeping dread, there's also the original soundtrack. Unlike much of the series, the OST is actually all about subtlety. It is almost never at the forefront, and it was designed to be this way. Most of it is either slower pieces, whether they be orchestral or industrial, and are meant to creep in alongside with the atmosphere.
On the topic of atmosphere, the duality of the soundtrack also contributes to this. As mentioned earlier, the physical setting is split into a physically dead world, i.e. the waste, and a mentally dead world, i.e. the domes. The soundtrack mirrors this, with a lot of its components being industrial pieces, mirroring the physical death present, and a lot of pieces having a pseudo-religious tone, adding to the spiritual component of the death of man. And it's very fascinating how the soundtrack blends these two seemingly disparate genres together and uses them flawlessly to help add to the atmosphere of the series.
They serve to cap the atmosphere present, and they get the job done very well in this regard. There are some exceptions, as action scenes do use more intense pieces like Prayer, and the opening is the noticeably uplifting Curie. On a whole, however, though, Ergo Proxy's OST is a good soundtrack, but it knows what it's here to do, and it's here to serve a background purpose. And this background purpose is what it excels at. It serves, instead of stimulating our conscious, which the series is very good at and apt to do, it serves to stimulate our subconscious and help set the seed. It helps our brains fit into the world of Ergo Proxy and get situated as we let the conscious parts of the series take over, and it's very good at facilitating this. Not all of the scenes are dark, however, and this leads us to the second point of the dark settings, and that is they serve to emphasize the bright characters present, those of Vincent, Raul, and Pino. You see, during the day, no one will see a light, but at the darkest night, a light can really shine bright. By keeping the setting so dark and mellow, the light of the cast are gradually allowed to rise to the top. Keeping a grim setting while characters evolve emphasizes that the progress they have made and their agency, while also realistically establishing they cannot fix everything. It shows us the need to establish our own raison d'etre, and it establishes that people can generally make do regardless of the situation and ascend beyond it. Thus, the dark settings also serve to help illustrate how uplifting the story actually is. So even if it's all dark, we can still see that there's quite a bit of light.
Unfortunately, though, this light is not all-encompassing, and that there are still dark elements present within the series in order to illustrate to us some dangers of nihilism and human folly. To prove this, we'll be taking a look at Daedalus Yameno.
Now I will preface this video by saying that while Daedalus is written in line with what was intended to be, and is very obviously conveying the messages his character was meant to, I don't like this character, as he makes me legitimately uncomfortable in some of his scenes, and I understand that some of his scenes make you uncomfortable too, so just a warning, this may not be for everyone. I just find him very creepy and complacent and annoying, though I feel this was by design. I feel the writing has done this intentionally, so I don't fault the show for this. With that out of the way, let's first ask, what does Daedalus do to get this perception from me? To start, Daedalus is introduced in episode 1, as he oversees the Monad proxy and its subsequent escape from captivity. Naturally, he then briefs Raul about all he knows, and proclaims that he is of course terrified, but also fascinated by the proxy, and proclaims that proxies hold the answer to all of man's questions and challenges. He then appears in episode 2 as the leader of the Health and Welfare Bureau, and gives Raul a psychiatric exam to clear her for work. Of course, she doesn't need the exam, and this is just a waste of time constructed by the Administrative Bureau, but Daedalus goes ahead and seems very concerned about her. A little too concerned, more on that later. When Raul finds she thinks she can trust him, though, she spills the beans on where Monad's body is, and Daedalus agrees to analyze it for her. Up until this point, he has been kind and helpful enough, if a little awkward and clingy, but he's just starting to give off an air about him, and it makes me uneasy. In line with being helpful, though, he helps Raul leave the dome for a bit to help find Vincent in the commune, although this does lead to the attack which seemingly kills Raul. Daedalus, now seemingly without any raison d'entrée, that is, a reason for being, no proxy, no Raul, is now dismissed from his post. This is a ruse, however, as Daedalus simply helped Raul fake her death, and then gave her anti-proxy bullets to bring down a proxy outside of the dome. Trying to capitalize on this, Daedalus next creates power outages to try and draw Raul to him and blackmail him. Although this fails when Raul points out that he didn't orchestrate the assassination attempt on Raul, and now Daedalus is now just in a bunch of hot water for letting Raul out. Fortunately for him, though, Raul says Daedalus can stay on as long as all his research now goes straight to him, Raul. With this in mind, Daedalus seems to be better than ever, as now he has both a powerful patron and confidence that his Raul will come back to him with a proxy. As time goes on, however, and it becomes obvious that Raul is more concerned in finding the truth and going on her own journey with Vincent, and not simply just returning with a proxy and not asking anything, Daedalus starts to act weird. And this is where stuff gets really weird. At first, he seems a little stressed or out of it. There's a few clips of him watching, childhood videos or something, but it's not really, the viewer just assumes, okay, he's a little stressed or something. He's slowly fading in and out. What's going on here? But things escalate quickly when next to him appears a young clone of Raul, which he refers to as the only real one. That is the only real Raul. Now, there were a couple of scenes of Daedalus watching stock footage of home videos, or just clips of Raul before, and he obviously has some attraction to her, but initially and I'm probably assuming a lot of viewers were like, oh, they're just friends, he's probably just reminiscing, or he probably misses her, because, they were friends, allegedly, and then I realized, no, this guy is just very, very, very creepy, and the creation of the clone is the tipping point. From here, he becomes more disconnected with reality as he recluses himself to his lab with the Raul/Monad clone, and uses his research to his own ends. These ends, ironically enough, though, are almost nothing, as he sees humanity as doomed anyways, and simply wants to live out his quiet fantasy existence with the clone of Raul. When finally given the ADW project, Daedalus has already kind of given up on anything, and just writes everyone off as a loser, apathetically going through with a project doomed to fail. One that he knows is doomed to fail. Now, it isn't specified if it's doomed to fail because it in it of itself is unfeasible, or because Daedalus purposely screws with it, although I wouldn't doubt with the latter, knowing his views on humanity by this point. By the time of Raul and Vincent's return, he is completely gone, referring to Raul as the traitor, and proclaiming that only he can be with Monad, or the clone of Monad that he has made. When the clone realizes who she is, a clone of Monad, and wants to help Vincent deal with his emotional struggles, she decides to go off and do so. And this is when Daedalus finally breaks for good, upset that his creation has left him. He is now upset that no one seems to really want to be with him, that nothing goes just as how he wanted it to do. He is upset that he is not in control, which is ironic due to how complacent he is. Having simply given up now, he proclaims that humanity is the loser, and that we're all cogs in a broken machine, which is gonna break anyways, so who cares, and he activates Ramdau's self-destruct sequence. His final act is pontificating to Raul on how pointless everything is, and why nothing matters. He simply gives up, and in an ultimate irony, the last thing he sees is his Monad clone fly into the sun, destroying itself, which is essentially what Daedalus does to himself. Now, with the summary out of the way, I think it's pretty easy to see why this character makes me uncomfortable. He's extremely creepy, and I don't think either me or YouTube really want me to go into detail on how, as it's pretty obvious and damning. There is also some surface level symbolism to touch on though before we get to the meat and potatoes of this character analysis. His name is taken from a very jealous Greek inventor, who had to flee authorities in Athens for trying to kill his nephew out of a fit of jealousy. This Daedalus, we'll refer to him as Greek Daedalus, then worked for King Minos of Crete, where he built the legendary Labyrinth, home of the Minotaur. This labyrinth, of course, was navigated by the hero Theseus with some magic string, As a side note, in Japan, a ball of string indicates the strings of fate, tying two people together, which is extremely creepy considering who Daedalus gives the ball of string to in this scene. Yeah, real creeper. Anyways, when everything went south in Crete for Greek Daedalus then fled on wings made of wax and watched as his son died because he flew too close to the sun and the wings' wax melted. Sound familiar? I also thought it was very ironic that the man in charge of the Wombsis was once so immature and infantile. I didn't really have anywhere else to put that, so I just put that there. This script is a little less scripted because I don't like this character, and I'm not gonna dilute how real I'm gonna be about this. That's not to say his character doesn't serve any points though, and Daedalus' inclusion is important because it does teach many important lessons to the viewer, lessons that we would need his presence for to learn. Lessons on what not to do. Daedalus serves as a foil to Raul, and is the exact opposite of him. As such, he manifests the flaws accompanying this. Opposite of Raul, Daedalus is complacent in the extreme. He cares only as long as what he wants is done and he is comfortable. However, what he wants is not always in line with what others want, and he often lacks the communication skills, power, or charisma to change this or himself. He lacks any adaptability or ability to deal with setbacks or personal rejection, and as a result cannot cope with the changing situations on the ground. Where Raul is a driven man who is led astray by his passions, Daedalus is apathetic in the extreme, caring really only for himself, which is ironic considering he is a doctor. Before anyone says anything, I do not think he actually cares for Raul, but instead simply wants her attention to feed his own ego and insecurities, i.e. he only really cares about feeling in charge and vindicated, and not really for Raul herself. Where Raul puts too much faith in humanity and its fighting spirit, Daedalus dismisses any type of confrontation as futile. Where Raul sees Ramdau as a bureaucratic hellscape, Daedalus sees it as his own personal sandbox to go about his own interest and research. Where Raul realizes that he is going against the grain and must work and stick his neck out to get things done, and Daedalus just kind of expects everything to be handed to him. Where Raul wants to take initiative and establish his own reason for being, Daedalus straight up refuses the notion of making one once his is taken from him, and kind of gives up. Where Raul deals with loss and eventually accepts it in dying, Daedalus denies it even as he dies. He is a spineless and spoiled brat, and if Raul embodies Nietzsche's will to power concept, Daedalus is a manifestation of the antithetical last man concept. Now this is another term made by Nietzsche, and it describes a person which is the product of such an incredibly sterile and decadent society as to have no real ambition or drive to improve. The last man is a nihilist who places no real value on anything other than a modicum of comfort and order. He has given up on the human spirit and sees most everything really as meaningless, simply going through the motions, all the while not showing any real impetus or ability or desire to take risks or grow. His quest for security is futile, however, as he is not willing to accept the risks needed to achieve personal growth. Instead, he just blames others for his own insecurities and sees them as the cause of them. As such, he slowly withdraws from interpersonal interactions and cannot deal with any kind of emotional setbacks. This of course creates a feedback loop, and he sinks deeper into nihilism, and we really see this with Daedalus. Early on, Daedalus seems relatively normal, though it's obvious he really wants Raul's attention in an overly helpful kind of creepy way. In fact, all his early actions serve this purpose. They serve to draw Raul to him, and again, I don't think it's necessarily because he has a healthy affection for her, but more of a creepy, insecure obsession. As such, he helps her bend the rules, and even gets in hot water with Raul. Though taunting Raul at first, Daedalus folds when Raul asserts his dominance, and then he just says, okay, and goes along with Raul's plan, because to him, it doesn't really matter. As a nihilist, Daedalus realizes that even if Raul's in charge of him, Daedalus still gets something he wants. He doesn't really care, honestly. He doesn't really try to stick up for anything, and while he despises Raul, he doesn't have the guts to really do anything or stick up for himself. He is unwilling to do much for himself or assert who he is. As a result, no one really takes him too seriously, and when the ramifications of this, i.e. Raul does not return affection, no one really takes him seriously, everyone thinks he's kind of weird, he cannot cope, or at least cope healthily. He tries to, and that's a very weird clone thing, as we've seen. As someone who seeks only comfort and expects everything to be handed to him, he cannot cope with someone exercising free will when it isn't what he had hoped for. As a result, he blames Raul for betraying him and starts his downward slide to insane nihilism. One of the greatest setbacks Daedalus has is losing his assigned reason for being, and his character is basically a massive criticism of not making one's own reason of being, and instead expecting everything to be done or explained by another party. While trusting those worthy of trust is an essential life skill, excessive trust in any system is usually not good, as it can lead to the kind of complacency haunting Daedalus, where Raul, Vincent, Raul, and Pino all accept that they don't really have an assigned reason for being, or they used to and they messed it up, or they don't know it, or some other thing. They all adapt. They all accept that they're human and they must grow. Daedalus does not. The aforementioned characters all cope with their struggles differently, but accept in the end that they do need to confront both themselves and the world around them to grow, and find answers both within and without. They need to grow so that they can assign their own reasons for being and pursue them, and take control of their own destiny. For this reason, all of these characters do achieve some sort of character growth, even if not for the best in Raul's case, and eventually come to terms with the world, affirming both themselves and their love of life. Daedalus does not do this, however, and as an unquestioning nihilist with way too much faith in a system he expects to provide everything for him, he simply gives up in the end. He accepts that the end is the end and refuses to move on and grow out of his attitude. He refuses to assign his life his own meaning once the going gets tough. He refuses to try and stand on his own feet, and thus acts as a warning against not using one's own agency. He is a warning about avoiding character growth and simply hoping everything will be given to you. He is a warning not to be the last man.
A last man who hopes that everything will be handed to him instead of having to earn anything. A last man who doesn't really have a point in life because he fails to assign himself a point of life. And this gets us into the conversation that Ergo Proxy holds about the idea of raison d'etre, that is, reason for being, and how it approaches it from two fundamentally different angles. On one side, there is a determinist angle, deciding that the point of life has already been determined for us, and that we must do our best to fall into line, sort of. On the other hand, and the side that Ergo Proxy seems to promote, is the idea of an existentialist point of view, where we exist to prove our point, that is, to ascertain what the point of our lives will be, and to try and meet it. We will be talking of one of the themes which is always hinted at in the background, and that is the raison d'etre. Now, this is a very prevalent background theme in the series, and the term means reason for being. Now, what this means is the purpose that someone is meant to fulfill, and ultimately what gives someone's life meaning and purpose. While the show ultimately states everyone should have one, it makes a point of discussing where one gets their raison d'etre from, and Ergo Proxy does this by comparing characters which take the opposite approaches to obtaining it, to see the quote best approach. On one side, there are those who favor a deterministic side of things, arguing that the purpose of life should be assigned from the start, or is assigned from the start, and therefore guides the development and entirety of one's life, and even can possibly be lost. This seems to be the persuasion of Daedalus and a good deal of the city government. On the other side, there is a more existential school of thought proclaiming that it is up to the individual to determine their own raison d'etre and work upon their own reasoning. This seems to be the school promoted by Raul, and ultimately Vincent and the show itself. But how does it do that? First, let's break down the two schools a little more. The deterministic school, as embodied by Daedalus, proclaims that everyone is created to fill a certain role according to a plan, which is above the individual and perhaps even their own comprehension. Daedalus and the government believe in this, and it is used even to control population numbers and every aspect of society in Ramdao. The argument for this is that exact measurements and assigned roles will allow for the exact precision and order in a society of this kind. Society can therefore be extremely organized and efficient. In addition, if everyone is assigned a role from birth, then they cannot feel any discontent that their life is meaningless, as it was essentially fated to be worth something, or to fulfill some role, or have some meaning. This also has the added benefit of attempting to make everyone feel at least somewhat valuable, as they are literally told from their very beginning of the great role that they are to fulfill. In theory, this approach as taken by Ramdao means that the city can be extremely well organized and that all its citizens can be productive and happy, excelling in their assigned roles that they were literally created for. Unfortunately, that's not how humanity works. Humanity is a very energetic and creative species, often questioning the status quo and seldom staying still. As quick learners, in fact, it is essential for humans to continue learning and questioning in order to fend off complacency, ignorance, stagnation, and ultimately regression. Therefore, the system Ramdao employs and hopes will create a perfect society is ultimately incompatible with humanity itself. Where assigning roles can create organization, the resultant apathy from assigned roles can bog down an organization. Where assigning a role could possibly assign value to one, it could also assign them aggravation or discontent should they not like what they're assigned. These can also lead to questioning, which is not something a rigid system like this is well equipped to handle. Even in the best case scenario,
where no one ultimately questions the system, all it will end up doing is managing to sustain itself, not evolving and barely treading water, ultimately stagnating. And this stagnation lowers creativity and resolve, making dealing with problems even more difficult when they do arise. A negative feedback loop of sorts arises, where the only constant result is a slow regression, as those maintaining the system grow more and more apathetic towards it. In addition, the idea of assigning a role creates the problem of role obsolescence, or redundance. If one's role is completed or redundant, but their whole existence is predicated upon it, then they too are, according to this system and worldview, redundant and stripped of a good deal of worth and agency, especially if they themselves have heavily played into this outlook. Thus, a theoretically great system is actually very flawed, and its own downfall byproduct of its unsustainable and inhuman ideals. We can see this both in the ruling council and Daedalus. While the ruling powers theoretically could do whatever they want to do in Ramdao, their obsession with maintaining the status quo ultimately means that they don't really do anything, and their great power is essentially squandered, until it's apparent that it's too late to really save the system, and a more forceful vision, that of Raul's, sweeps them aside. They are essentially rendered powerless by their unwillingness to use their power in any way other than exactly prescribed by themselves. Daedalus is a more human example of this. As someone who seems to deeply believe in this determinist outlook, he strives to maintain as much order and control as possible. He sees lab-grown humans not as unnatural or uncomfortable, as many of the other casts do, but instead a sort of odd pinnacle of detail. A pinnacle of detail orientation and organization for maintaining a system which is ultimately meant to do nothing more than sustain itself. With its orderly nature, he thinks that this system, however, is a pinnacle of structure. He lets the false security provided by this swoon him, and in the end grows extremely complacent and ultimately bitter when things don't necessarily play along to how he thinks they should. He is stagnated under the expectation that everyone will stay on script, and when they don't, and when it is apparent that the script isn't even that important, he cannot cope with these revelations and simply gives up. This leads us to discussing the other school of thought mentioned in the series, and that is the existentialism school of thought. This school of thought asserts that there is purpose in life. However, purpose can only be assigned by the person that it applies to, and thus it is deeply personal. Now, this school of thought is not perfect, and the show does explore some of the flaws associated with it. For one, while the individual can assume their self-worth by assigning their own purpose, determining what that purpose could be is not always easy and often requires a good deal of effort to nail down. We see this with Vincent, who takes a while to fully get on board with his quest for the truth and has to undergo quite a bit of growth along the way. Another flaw of the system is that a person may not necessarily choose the best path for themselves, and this can mean that they pursue goals which may not necessarily be beneficial to themselves or the collective. We see this with Raul, who ends up pursuing the very self-destructive path of trying to destroy Vincent and drastically reshape the status quo. While these criticisms are justified, though, this outlook on life, at least as stated by the show, has much greater strengths. For one, the fact that this system allows the individual to assign their goals and purposes mean that the individual is always invested and encouraged to grow and learn. This feeds into the human nature noted earlier and creates a positive feedback loop, where growth itself may even become a goal. This system encourages growth so that one can pursue their own goals, which will in turn see them grow more. And this in turn fortifies the individual to better deal with unplanned obstacles or situations. Where Daedalus just kind of gives up when it's apparent that the script doesn't really matter, Raul, Vincent, and even Raul to some extent are comfortable going off script and even trying to make their own script. They learn from revelations and move on with life and go along with the punches. Since faith is not placed in such a rigid and literal system as to place one's assigned role at birth, there is no existential danger of the self being destroyed by a failing system. As a result, while this path may seem more difficult and labor-intensive, it is ultimately more sustainable for the individual and therefore collective society. And that is what Ergo Proxy is telling us in its discussion of the raison d'être. It is saying that there is in fact reason and reasons for life, however, they cannot be assigned by others, and that we must be the ones assigning those to ourselves.
And we see this in the remainder of the cast, which we'll start to take a look at now. Now, seeing as that he is the least significant of the remaining four, we'll start with Raul Creed, not only because of that reason, but because, like the rest of the cast that remains, he also does exhibit a strong individualist streak and does try to assert his own identity and his own point of life, and his own raison d'etre. And even if it's not completely successful and does have consequences for society in general, he does still manifest a very strong human spirit and desire to live.
Quick note, it is spelled Raul, but I think they pronounce it Raul throughout the series, or Raul? Raul? I think it's Raul. So I might use these interchangeably. just so you know it's the same guy. I chose to start with this character because while all the characters of Ergo Proxy are very complex, as mentioned before, and are to embody a sort of philosophical point or argument, I feel that the one posed by Raul was the easiest to understand on a surface level, and for that reason is a good starting point for our character examinations. Raul Creed is introduced early in the series as the new head of the Security Bureau, and one tasked with hunting down the escaped proxy, all the while keeping the issue very hush-hush. As such, he tries to keep Raul quiet and wrap up the whole proxy affair as soon as possible. He soon learns that there are 2 proxies about, however, and is about to file a report on this when he remembers something important. He remembers that he used to meet his new family at the mall. As such, he calls it a day and heads on to the mall to meet them. Unfortunately, this is the same mall which ends up seeing the Monad versus Vincent fight, and both his wife and new child perish, while his auto-rev pseudo-daughter Pino is separated from them. Now, having just been stripped of everything from him, right in front of him, but still expecting to do his job, Raul starts to develop a personal loathing for both Vincent and the administration of the city, who seem pretty ambivalent about his great loss. As such, he frames Vincent for the mall attack, though this only ends up seeing Vincent leave Pino out the airlock of the dome. Raul, however, learns that Vincent is outside the dome, and still seeks to have him brought to justice in his eyes, as his instincts tell him that Vincent has the answers he seeks. From here, Raul starts to slowly but surely act more emotionally and chip away at established procedure. It starts with forgetting to file a report that Vincent is alive and outside of the commune, and, eventually goes to destroying said commune and other behaviors. As he becomes more and more obsessed with his quest to get Vincent, he starts to become more individualistic and realizes the bureaucratic hell that Ramdao is. He realizes that he is living in a very artificial and stifling environment, one which he thinks is holding him down. He also realizes that there are others looking for Vincent, and starts to feud with Raul and Daedalus for the same reasons, as he sees them as obstacles. By episode 10, Raul has embraced who he is, in his own words, and starts to shed the air of parody which he has sort of maintained up until this point. He becomes more and more of a cold and calculating man, very single-minded. When Daedalus starts causing blackouts to get his attention, and try and blackmail him, Raul turns the tables on him and ends up blackmailing Daedalus instead, although all he asks Daedalus is to continue researching the proxy for him. In addition, frustrated by the plotting pace of the administration, Raul starts to openly loathe and question them. His questioning only intensifies in episode 15 when an intercepted feed from the MCQ show Something's Up in Rondo. This accumulates 2 episodes later when Raul calls out the regent for his complacency, berates the powerlessness of everyone involved, and gets fired, and then fires off an ICBM in defiance. Instead of getting killed for this, however, and also knowing that, they're pretty useless, and that Raul did have some points about stagnation, the governing council instead gives Raul almost carte blanche to do what he sees fit for the goodness of Rondo. As such, Raul proclaims that they will make a society free of gods, one past gods, and that they will overcome the obstacles of the world on their own, and reshape the world for humanity's sake, to fight for their very existence. As such, he instructs Daedalus to genetically modify the population so it can survive outside of the dome, and he also dabbles in martial law. As the city slowly descends into chaos because of the failures of all of his experiments, Raul does take some comfort in Vincent's return. This is because it allows him an opportunity to shoot him with one of the proxy-killing bullets, although it fails to kill Vincent, and Raul just ends up mortally stabbed by the Monad clone under Daedalus' instruction because of a squabble with Daedalus. Daedalus is the exact opposite of Raul, a very complacent man, willing to see everything around him burn and everyone die as long as he's comfortable. A man with almost no sense of fighting. As he stumbles through the burning city he has made, Raul seems to reflect on the path that got him here, and does seem to show some regret as he expresses a wish to simply see Pino, his last living relative, one last time. This request is granted as he is pushed upon a shard of glass and bleeds out, ironically dying in the city he sought to escape. With such a long story, it's no surprise that Raul is a very complex character. He starts off as a very professional and distant, yet oddly passionate man. He's a man who believes in results and has a good deal of self-control to start. Though as this wears away over time, we soon start to see a man with much more animalistic and defiant traits. A man who lets his passions guide him in his quest to fix everything. A quest which ultimately ends up breaking everything because he becomes more focused on big, vague goals and revenge than realism, stability, and results. You see, Raul Creed, as plainly stated in the series, is the force which above all else stands for breaking free of the constraints of the world. He is a manifestation of the will to power. Now, the will to power is a very nebulous term used by the philosopher Nietzsche, which can mean anything from the will to grow personally, the will to grow your wealth, the will to get strong physically, the will to political power, the will to live. Very nebulous, and it's not systematically defined. As such, it's a term with both very positive and very negative interpretations, and Raul's case can be seen as a tragic and negative one. His will to power is an irrational manifestation brought upon by both his own nature and the trauma he has been through. He wills to power because of his past experiences being powerless. His own emotions, however, taint his objectivity, and it means that his power and his will to power is never 100% clean or never 100% well guided. And instead, Raul becomes a sort of ends justifying the means kind of guy. He doesn't do this out of an inherent malevolence, but because of his irrational will to power, which wants to see him destroy what he thinks is holding him down, and in turn, he wants to reshape the world to be better in his eyes.
Now, I'd like to take a brief second to touch on some of the symbolism assigned to Raul. Now, if we look at Raul's citizen ID number, we can see a clear trio of numbers indicating that there is some kind of element of symbolism to him. And I think the element here is that he sort of represents a failed ascension, a failed idea, or the dangers of man trying to fly too close to the sun. We see this with the fact that while he proclaims there's no God, he tries to act like one, and this ultimately brings consequences down on Ramdo. It is shown by the fact that while he thinks that man can solve everything, he is just a human and in the end can't necessarily accomplish any of the tasks he set forward for himself alone, let alone for society. It's kind of a commentary on how man needs something to kind of fill spiritual gaps in his existence. And whether that is religious or not, it cannot solely be man. And in this way I find it's kind of an odd contradiction of Nietzsche, where Nietzsche says that the Superman will ascend into a new morality based solely on effort. Raul kind of proves the pitfalls in this theory by showing that even effort alone will not necessarily get a man to the highest plane, as Raul tries very hard but ultimately ends up lost and ultimately destroys himself and his community. I think it's kind of a commentary on how the death of God, while seen as inevitable, is not necessarily inevitable, complete, as A, new quote God is created when Daedalus makes the Monad clone and Vincent returns, and B, something is needed to fill the spiritual gap in humanity, as Raul, trying to fill it completely on his own, has manifested itself in terrible consequences. He's kind of a caricature of a charismatic figure who has led people astray, and again, this fits with the citizen ID number, and in turn has led them to destruction. It's kind of a commentary on how man cannot necessarily do everything alone.
Now, from the very first episode, we can clearly see a desire to operate with less constraints placed upon him, and the irritation that restraints put upon him. He seems to loathe the fact that his job is to protect the people, but the government see people as kind of expendable. This frustrates him as it means both he and the citizens that he is to protect are both kind of pointless, just cogs in a giant machine, and he thus seeks to add meaning to his life. Now, as a man with family, initially it seems like this gives him meaning, as it is implied he is relatively strongly attached to Pino, and probably his wife, but the death of his family only makes things worse, as he is expected to, and ultimately does for a little bit, act professionally about the incident and simply keep working. While this incident obviously creates a hate of Vincent, I would also think it creates a hate of the administration, as said administration literally called them expendable. While this may be true in the cold calculus of a city run by computers prioritizing stability, numbers, and order, to a person, family is not expendable. As such, his time as chief of security leads him to learning too much, and realizing that Ramdo is simply a stagnating pool waiting to be iced over. The limitations placed on him, a man of seeming authority, and his own losses at the hands of the proxy embitter him enough to try and overthrow the system. While this starts with snarky comments and questioning, it does eventually spark a very strong will to power. To him, destroying the system is the best possible thing to do, as in his eyes, the current system will lead to death via slow strangulation of the human soul. In his eyes, the current path only spells death anyways, albeit at a much slower one via stagnation and degeneration. He sees the kind of society Ramdo fosters, one which is very limited in initiative and ability, one of crippling comfort and sterile uncreativity, and he sees how such a system is so unnatural for humanity, a species which is very creative and rebellious by nature. He despises how the system handicaps him and prevents him from being his true self, in his eyes. As a man with nothing to lose now, he embraces this idea and embraces his animalistic instincts and dedicates himself to creating a new world without gods. Now, this statement can be interpreted many ways, and ultimately I feel its mixed message is very much in line with his character. On one hand, he knows the proxies are now unreliable and humanity must fight to exist. He knows that it is the natural instinct of living creatures to try and live more, and as such he wants to reinstill that instinct into the population so that they can better themselves. He knows that the people of Ramdo still have some agency, or at least potential to seek out agency, and he seeks to harness this to lead a sort of humanocentric revolution. He seeks for humanity to pick itself up, under his guidance, of course. And in this way, it is an inspirational message, just to see a man living in a society so lacking in humanity try and spark humanity back into the people, in a vain attempt to rally them to live again and be human again. On the other hand, this declaration also has very clear red flags. Regardless of whether or not God exists, the concept of God alone has enough power over the government to keep it in line. It keeps the government from misusing all of its technological marvels, and it leads the government to seeking as conservative and stable a path as possible. Now, while this does create the stagnation issue mentioned earlier, and it no doubt would kill society as they are overprotective of it, Raul's solution and his declaration of human revolution go way too far in the opposite direction, removing all bounds that this reverence placed on city policy and decision making. Things that old beliefs prevented out of reverence now happen widely, and the results are devastating. They are not devastating because Raul says there is no God, but because he tries to become one in a sense, and he tries to surpass every limitation placed on man, something which humanity cannot do, as we are all flawed and imperfect creatures. Which oddly enough, he also recognizes, but seems to kind of ignore as he puts his quest first. Now, his will to power and drive to reshape the world lead him to try and tear everything down, and tearing down the system too fast and too thoroughly have horrible ramifications for everyone involved. Thinking he knows best, he lets his arrogance get to him, and now given complete power over the city, he uses his power to carry out two main objectives. 1. He seeks to save humanity by authorizing the disastrous ADW project, which is a form of genetic modification. This project basically started with Raul telling Daedalus, hey, modify the genome, see what happens, make Superman, yeah, do something like that. Now, this does not happen, of course, and instead the project fails and ends up having a 90% mortality rate. The other thing Raul does is he becomes obsessed with killing Vincent Law, the man who he thinks ruined his life. He blames Vincent for his wife's death, for taking Pino away, for censoring the security bureau, and just all around ruining Ramdao in his life. Although ironically enough, if none of these things had happened, Raul never would have rose to power in the first place. He probably still would have been comfortable and complacent enough to never really question the system too much. Although, it is stated every security bureau chief ends up getting fired for learning too much. Although, in Raul's case, it probably would have taken longer. Anyways, his preoccupation with Vincent and his revenge quest costs him dearly, as he loses both focus and the ability to make sound judgment.
Now, with all this said, and even with noting his citizen ID number and some of the symbolism attached to it, at least how I interpret it, is Raul what I would consider a bad person? I would say not intentionally so. Well, he does kind of ruin Ramdo and does destroy a lot. And again, it is not necessarily out of an inherent malevolent drive, but first manifests from a deep drive to destruction caused from depression and loss, and later from a renewed sense of vigor brought on by his quest for power. Now, again, his quest for power is not necessarily to enrich himself, but to try and save Ramdo and his citizens. It just happens that he's a very, 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 very misguided man, and that this manifests itself in very destructive projects. While I would not say he's a good man, I would not say he's necessarily the devil himself, as he does show connection to his family and genuine remorse for having lost them, especially Pino, and simply seems to be a man lashing out in a world which is so uncaring. For that reason, I do consider him more of a tragic character than an inherent malevolent character. He does serve very well as an antagonist, though I would say more of a tragic one than one necessarily acting out of pure spite or malevolence. Again, that's not to say he's a good man. I will go on record as saying that he's probably a bad man, but it is, again, just to say that these bad behaviors and bad actions came from a place of emotional vulnerability, came from a place of loss, and not necessarily from a place of intentional evil.
This paints Raul as a sort of tragic character, as his disastrous quest for power is simply brought upon by his own desire to no longer be powerless. He simply wants to try and help everyone in his own warped kind of way. As such, even though he can be a cold, rude, selfish man, a man who doesn't really seem to care about anyone else, it is somewhat hinted at that he does value humanity, or at least sees great potential in it, and seeks to use that potential to better itself. As such, Raul's a very ironic character as well. Ironically, he tried to save humanity, yet the last member of his family he wanted to see was an autorev. Ironically, in his quest to kill God, he is killed by a clone of God made by man. Ironically, while he wanted to save his people, he just ends up killing them all. Ironically, while he wants to be a logical and controlling man, he is consumed by his emotional urges and loses all control. Ironically, while he painted embracing humanity as the solution to all the issues of the world, he instead is consumed by his own humanity and his own human flaws.
For all his flaws, though, I do think it's important to note that his love of his daughter is not one of them, and Pino is actually a very important part of Ergo Proxy, even if she is just a child who, objectively, does not do that much, as she greatly humanizes the cast and serves as a manifestation of life going on and continuing in spite of the bleak circumstances present.
Before we explore these reasons, though, who is Pino? Pino is the companion motto auto-rave belonging to Raul Creed and his wife. While Raul seems genuinely attached to Pino, passing on his love of piano and music, his wife, maybe not so much. She seems indifferent to her, and when she and Raul are given a child, even question Pino's worth and if she has cognito virus or not. While Vincent says she does not, Pino's mother still seems detached, and her detachment is shown by the fact she seems to turn off her Turing, that is emotional, functions from time to time. After Vincent clears Pino of having cognito, though, she remains with her family until the Monad Mall attack, which kills both her mother and her brother. From here, it appears she may have got cognito and wanders off to the secret exit used by infected auto-revs. Along the way, she meets Vincent and quickly endeavors to help him and be a good friend. In fact, she's actually the one who saves him by opening the airlock and being flushed out with him. Once in the commune, she starts to stick with Vincent, and the kind Vincent cannot help but do his best to guide and protect her. She finds her iconic melodica here as well, and befriends this young boy. In the commune, she starts to learn how to be human and accepts to express her emotions and soul. At first, she still seems kind of mechanical, and this is shown through the fact that she randomly answers questions with long numbers and mathematically, she's very ambidextrous, and the fact that she can't draw new images, i.e. she doesn't quite have creativity yet. As the series progresses, though, she starts to be more and more human and grows quite close to Vincent, who becomes a sort of father or big brother to her. Like a real child, she starts to imitate those around her, and from here, these imitations lessen and she becomes more of herself, learning what does and doesn't work for her. We can see that this is especially true after the arrival of Raul. At first, the two seem ambivalent towards each other, but as time progresses, the two start to grow closer and closer, and even save each other. When the group returns to Ramdao, Pino seems to stay outside for a bit, although she can't help but be curious about what's going on inside. Braving the burning dome, she inadvertently grants her father's dying request to see her before he passes, and she meets Christina, who returns her melodica to her, which she had lost, and helps her escape. Now on the Senzon, she rescues Raul, and the two head to pick up Vincent. With Raul explained, we now ask, what does Pino do? To start, with the literal tasks, and as mentioned by others, in many episodes, Pino serves as a sort of white rabbit. She leads Vincent and Raul to discover something or make a helpful observation. She leads Vincent to the airlocks at the beginning of the series. She leads both him and Vincent to the caves where they see the failed humans. She observes that Ophelia is a shapeshifter in the Ophelia Dome, and many other things. Many times, she serves to spark both the curiosity of the cast and the viewer. She does more than this, though. Her greatest task, and indeed performance, is humanizing most of the cast, and bringing a warm human dimension to the show that would not be present otherwise. All of this is quite ironic, seeing as that she's an android. Her humanizing task is done in two ways that we'll explore, and both of which are critical to the show. These two ways are her personal growth and her interactions with others. Starting with her own growth, Pino's growth into a real child is well documented in the series. She starts off as a sort of pre-programmed imitation child, something meant to imitate, but something that isn't quite the real thing. After her infection with cogito begins, though, she starts from this base and slowly evolves. This evolution can be seen in her drawings. At first, she's ambidextrous and draws extremely fast and precisely, like a robot. However, like a robot, she lacks the ability of creativity, and can only make recreations of pictures she has already seen. As the series progresses, though, she starts to grow left-handed, like Vincent, and by the end of the series, learns how to draw on her own, i.e. from her own creative impulses, her own soul. While these drawings may not look so advanced as some of her earlier works, they actually show a great deal of personal and human growth. She has gained a soul and humanity. This is why these look like childlike drawings, as opposed to the drawings of, say, a printer. This growth also extends into both her interactions with others and her views of herself. Again, at first she starts as something programmed to be friendly, something nice but not quite real. As she explores the world with Vincent, though, she starts to express the full spectrum of emotions, as she comes across different situations which provoke different feelings. The first critical step on this journey is learning what sad is in the commune. While she doesn't like it at first, she learns to accept it, and learns that if one must be happy, sometimes they must also be sad. Later on, she also learns emotions of frustration, joy, confusion, pain, anger, fear, love, courage, and many others, all by imitating and learning from her role models of Vincent and later Raul. In the beginning of the series, she seems nice but oddly detached, not quite empathetic. By the end, though, she's fully human and genuinely empathetic. She serves as kind of a rock for both Vincent and Raul, a sort of warming presence to help them get through with their journey, and she teaches those around her to value the others around them, as she herself has now learned to value those around her on a deep emotional level. All of this growth is best summarized by Pino herself, who says that even though having a soul comes with sad and angry and scared, it also comes with joy and courage and curiosity and happiness. Having a soul makes her happy, and she accepts that even if it comes at the cost of occasional negative emotions and pain and hardships, it is worth it, because in the end it makes her happy, and she can be happy. And this leads to her interactions with others, and how she humanizes most of the cast and the show itself. Realistically and basically, as a child in a very dangerous and resource-poor world, Pino at first may seem like a burden. She is curious and tends to wander off, and doesn't necessarily bring too much material stuff to the team. However, her endearing nature, warm presence, and the fact that she's helpful from time to time validate her presence. And the fact that others go out of their way to protect her shows that they are in fact good people, and this is how she humanizes a lot of the cast. Her presence serves to show the beginnings of Vincent's evolution, for example. At the start of the series, he seems like a complete coward with no real redeeming traits. However, one of the first validating things he does to prove otherwise is protect Pino from scout drones in the commune. From here, the interactions of the two show just how kind and empathetic a man Vincent really is. Their father-daughter relationship shows that Vincent is a kind, caring man, in addition to being a super powerful proxy. It shows that he is more than one-dimensional, and that he is human too, with a soft and caring side. He is not a monster. On the topic of fathers, Pino also humanizes her dad, Raul, who it is shown genuinely cared for her and enjoyed teaching her things like piano. While Raul is a cold and ruthless man throughout much of the series, his lingering thoughts on her shows that he is still a bit human, and his final request to see her, before he passes, cements him as someone who is simply trying to get over the loss of his family. Finally, this brings us to Raul. At first, Raul sees auto-revs as simply tools, nothing near human, and a bit annoying from time to time. She even goes as far as to call Pino useless in her first interactions with her. With Iggy's death, though, and living with Pino for a while, Rael's vision is expanded, and she becomes a much more empathetic woman. She goes from calling Pino useless to actively trying to rescue her to being rescued by Pino herself. While Pino is learning empathy, she also teaches Rael all about it, and that's Pino's greatest purpose. As she learns to be human, she helps the cast learn to reconnect to their humanity as well, both through simple human interactions and genuine questions. She in turn lightens both the character of the cast and the mood of the show by quite a bit. As a whole, she shows that there is still hope, and her presence as a child shows that life still goes on. The idea of life going on is another key thing that Pino brings to the table. While the rest of the cast consists of adults who have either reached what they're going to do with their life, i.e. like Daedalus or Raul, or are just kind of getting by or need to do something very important and pressing, like say Raul or Vincent, Pino is a child, and she still has a world of possibilities open to her. Her character growth and presence are kind of the show's greatest affirmation of the power of life and the fact that it will always go on. While a character like Daedalus serves as a nihilistic influence to say, hey, everything is doomed, who cares, nothing's gonna go anywhere, why are we even trying? Pino's presence does the exact opposite. Her growth and happiness, even in the face of such overwhelming odds, even as a child, show that life does go on, and it will find a way. Her bright character brightens the message of the show, and it helps convey the show's greatest message, which is the idea that humanity will endure, and that humanity can overcome with sufficient character growth. As mentioned in Raul's video, character growth alone will not overcome the entirety of the world. It will, however, though, help someone get through the hard parts of life and endure. Her growth as a real human girl shows that humanity will continue to evolve and grow with the world around it, and that this process may not necessarily need be painful or dark all the time. Pino's character itself is actually very bright, and this shows that growth is something to be treasured. Even though she does affirm that it does come with pain and negative emotions sometimes, she also affirms that it is always worth it. She affirms that the human spirit can in some cases be undefeatable, and can in many cases overcome great external odds. She affirms that there is a good will to life, and that life must go on, as it is the will of all living creatures to continue living. She affirms that that is a beautiful process as well, shown by the fact that even though her world seems completely grave and destitute, she still has a happy family life with her new adopted family. She shows truly that life will go on, and that life itself is beautiful.
And I think this is a very overlooked theme of Ergo Proxy, as many tend to get distracted by the bleak aesthetic, the bleak surface layer of the show, which obscures a very heartwarming and very warm message of rebirth and of life continuing on and the beauty of life itself. Now, this leads us to the discussion of the behavioral sink and death, and how Ergo Proxy ultimately ends up refuting these, at least to some extent, to prove that it is a narrative about rebirth and the power of the human spirit, as opposed to one where humanity slowly fades into oblivion.
We're going to be focusing on something which I feel a lot of post-apocalyptic anime, or shows in general, try to comment on, and that is the idea of the behavioral sink and stagnation, and ultimately nihilism. Now, Ergo Proxy is a commentary on many things, and among the many things it comments on are the idea of the behavioral sink and nihilism. The show does this by tying the two together, and then ultimately refuting nihilism. But first, what are these concepts that the show discusses? Now, the behavioral sink and nihilism are concepts with a great amount of nuance to them, but can also be boiled down to relatively simple cores. The behavioral sink is a term coined by John B. Calhoun, and it's a controversial phenomenon accredited to overcrowding and abundant resources other than space. In these conditions, purposely created and simulated for mice by Calhoun, individuals seem to exhibit a variety of negative behaviors, ranging from increased and unwarranted aggression to complete social withdrawal up until the point where the population essentially stagnates and then collapses in on itself, even though there's still an objectively abundant amount of other resources, such as food and water. Now, this phenomenon was observed in mice by Calhoun, so it's controversial if such things truly occur in humans, but it is noted that people do need certain amounts of space and time dedicated to themselves to maintain mental health and maintains healthy social interactions, and that the increased anxiety and decreased space in some urban settings can be detrimental to one's mental health. Nihilism, on the other hand, is a school of philosophy that, while quite diverse, usually manifests itself in its dismissal and or skepticism of anything having any intrinsic value, and the concept that most things and undertakings are essentially pointless. In the show, these two concepts are tied together by the interactions and nature of the dome cities and the nature of the proxy project itself. The domes serve as manifestations of the behavioral sink, and their seemingly abundant resources and consumerist ethos overcoat a stagnating and decaying society, which, for the most part, seems either quite apathetic or artificial. And we can see this further with certain behavioral manifestations carried out by the city's leadership. In the case of the Regent and the Governing Council, and Daedalus to some extent, these behavioral oddities seem to manifest any sort of withdrawal. The regent and governing bodies are never seen outside of the throne room, and while Daedalus does leave his offices from time to time, he doesn't really seem to have too many human interactions. Even on a professional scope, he seems to prefer either isolation or the company of autorevs. Now, the one exception to this, of course, is his creepy obsession with Raul, although this could also be argued to be some kind of behavioral abnormality, a deviant behavior brought upon by his environment. As for aggression, we can see this in the case of Raul, who, while being upset for justified reasons, is completely consumed by rage, and even after affirming his will to live, goes on to lose his sanity on his crazy revenge quest. The declining mental health of the city, brought upon by the sink and objectively bad environment outside, then combine to form a sort of nihilist miasma, which hovers over the dome and within the dome. Knowing that the outside is toxic and that the proxy plan was a backup to the humans waiting in space anyways, the city government is kind of devalues everything it does in the domes, and the domes themselves. As a result, human life itself is devalued, and people are born to serve the dome, even though in the beginning it was planned to be the exact opposite. As such, those in charge of the dome lose all drive and initiative, and instead of trying to make progress themselves, are content to simply stew about and await something out of their control to happen. Just think, if Ramdao is this technological and consumerist marvel it seems to be, wouldn't the people inside have the resources to put together some kind of colonization or cleanup scheme? Couldn't they develop filters to scrub the air, or a vaccine to make people immune to its toxins, or set up a series of smaller colony domes? Couldn't they objectively do something other than await death? And the answer is probably, at least from an objective point of view, yes. Though it is here that we must consider the subjective point of view. As mentioned earlier, the city sees no point in this, as it is convinced of its nihilistic views, and thus condemns itself to squander its resources and ultimately die. Instead, the behavioral deviations brought upon by the behavioral sink are allowed to continue because the government has either given up hope or can't be bothered to hope. Even arguing that this lack of initiative was born out of respect to wait for Vincent's return, wouldn't the benevolent creator of Ramdale want his people to succeed? Would he really be opposed to any attempts at cautious growth?
Would he really instead want this malformation of a society to continue on its current path? Now, quick tangent. When I say malformation of a society, I mean to say that the society of Ramdao itself also seems to be some kind of hellish creation of the behavioral sink. While it is clear that some in the higher classes still seem to enjoy some kind of humanity or human interaction, the society itself seems very unhealthy. There is a very strong push for blind consumerism. Human interaction seems to be within an all-time low, with these maybe possible exceptions of the professional sphere. People are consumed by their so-called assigned purposes, and while it is clear that some in the higher class are doing okay, those in the lower case are probably not doing okay. It is a very stratified society glorifying ignorance, or at least pushing for ignorance, where everyone is literally assigned a role at birth, and where actual questioning of the human condition is censored and drowned out by a consumerist tsunami. Individuality is highly discouraged, and those on the bottom must abandon themselves if they wish to ascend to anything slightly higher. We can see this especially in the immigrant districts, where a quote model citizen is basically someone who doesn't question anything or think anything of their government other than vague positive. Even in the higher levels of government, the behavioral sink's effects cannot be outran, as not only do they contribute to the stagnant mindset mentioned earlier, but also a hell of bureaucracy and shuffling the deck chairs. Objectively, many of the interdepartmental squabbles and beefs we see throughout the series are not really too important. While Raul and Daedalus, for example, have different mindsets and departments, they are theoretically on the same team, and shouldn't beef as much as they really do. Instead, they should try to work together. In the nihilistic world of the sink, however, there really is no point or drive to anything, so objectivity becomes lost and the two feud with each other over no real reason. Again, while there is window dressing of a reason here, Raul wants to stop Raul so he can get to Vincent first, and Daedalus wants to help Raul because he's unstable and creepy, this isn't objectively enough if we think about it. None of these people really care about their orders from the top, so couldn't they construct some kind of mutually beneficial conspiracy? Well, I think they definitely could. They cannot, however, as in a world where nothing really matters, people struggle to come together for any kind of greater goal. Again, I don't necessarily think that this is weak writing, but an active commentary on how stagnation of a society via a behavioral sink ultimately drives people apart. They are driven so far apart, in fact, that they obsess over meaningless formalities. And this is what I mean when I say shuffling the deck chairs. This phrase references the pointless nature of moving chairs on a sinking ship, and is well applied here. Is the red tape in Ramdao really needed? Did the Regent really have to censor literally everything related to the truth or the proxy? Did Daedalus really need to try and blackmail Raul? Did Raul really need to try and push Daedalus and Raul completely out of the picture? The answer to all these is realistically no, but the nihilism of the Dome has fostered a world in which, for to those who did do it, it was very important, because they struggled to reconcile their desire for meaning with the denial of any meaning by the system present. And this leads us to how the show goes on to refute nihilism, and ultimately affirm the beauty of life itself. While it may seem very dark, Ergo Proxy in fact goes much out of its way to refute nihilism, and is actually a much brighter show than it initially seems, and it does this by discussing the ideas of rebirth. Although Ergo Proxy's story is seemingly very dark, it's actually a tale of rebirth, and the undefeatable nature of life itself. This is seen in both the development of the main cast and the world of Ergo Proxy itself. When the series starts, the Earth of Ergo Proxy is blatantly stated and implied to be a dead world. It is simply dismissed as such. Its dust and air are toxic after all, and the world outside the dome is really seen as nothing. Life in the dome isn't much better, as we've already discussed though, and this seeming paradise of organization is really a stagnating paradise of boredom. And this is where the story begins, in a world seemingly both dead inside and outside of the dome. As the series progresses though, we see that this isn't true. Inside of the domes, the main cast start to show that humanity isn't completely dead. Characters like Raul, Vincent, Pino, and even Raul show that humanity isn't done yet, and might even bounce back. They, in their development, show that life is still going on and finds a way, and that soon they will start to manifest their humanity and lives in even more lively ways. In a literal sense, the quest of Raul and Vincent takes them to many strange lands, and these places show that humanity is not all alone on this world either. The commune sees some bugs about, and fish in the water. The forest shows plants still go on and even thrive in some areas. People can and do adapt to the air, and some even live in the wastes, which, while they are wastes, are not completely inhospitable or dead. Life is slowly going on and seemingly bouncing back. The Earth itself is undergoing a rebirth. It is in this world where we see our main cast grow even more, proving that they are humans and still alive and that life still has a chance.
In fact, they grow to embrace life and affirm it, proving life will continue even in the seemingly dead wastes. However, while life outside the domes seems to be slowly coming back, life in the dome deteriorates. It turns out that denying the meaning and beauty of life is not conducive to it. This accumulates when Ramdel itself collapses and the dome is destroyed by a proxy who sees life as pointless and ultimately wants to destroy humanity. While some might see the collapse of Ramdel as symbolic as the final collapse of humanity, it seems more simply to mean the age of the dome is dead, and that nihilism itself has failed in this regard. And this means that the era of stagnating death, the era of the dome, is slowly coming down and in fact being replaced, and in fact being subsumed by an era of slow rebirth. This is confirmed when humanity descends from the colony ships long in orbit to recolonize their ancestral home and hearken a new age of life. As such, Ergo Proxy proclaims that life is beautiful, and that nihilism is something that we should not embrace, as it will only destroy life, which is a beautiful thing. It also says that life will go on to overcome these challenges presented by nihilism, and that by overcoming nihilism and the behavioral sinks of the world, humanity can still live on, no matter what the circumstances. As such, Ergo Proxy refutes nihilism itself and affirms the beauty of life, and the point of life.
And we see these affirmations most in Vincent Law, arguably the main character of the series, and the one that it is sort of named after, Ergo Proxy. Now in Vincent Law, we see someone who doesn't quite know about the beauty of life, who just tries his best to survive according to the mandates set before him by others, and someone who is constantly afraid to push the boundaries of himself and what he can do. And throughout the series, we see him push these boundaries to eventually become the best version of himself, as he evolves from someone consumed by the behavioral sink to someone who has escaped it and been reborn to some extent, to someone who has learned to love life.
In many ways, Vincent is the exact opposite of Raul, although this often works to the benefit of both the show, and the two complement each other extremely well. They learn much from each other and grow in each other's weaknesses and strengths as the show progresses. But what exactly do they learn, and what do they do? To answer the latter question, Vincent Law is introduced in episode 1 as an immigrant from Mosque who currently works taking down infected autorevs in the lower levels of Ramdel City. He is initially a very meek man who, for some reason, was pursued by Monad Proxy, and this of course results in the Monad Mall massacre. However, when Monad finally seems to corner Vincent, oddly enough, Monad is the one that doesn't make it out alive, although this will be visited later. However, Raul Creed, seeing his family murdered and now needing someone to take the heat for the mall attack and the Raul attack, blame Vincent for all of these things, and he kind of scapegoats him from here. This causes Raul to label Vincent a fugitive and chase him throughout the dome. Of course, when he finally finds him, after tracking Raul down, who tracks Vincent down herself, Vincent escapes through the airlock with the help of Pino. It is here that he now enters the commune, and inadvertently dooms it by destroying a patrol drone, although Vincent ends up fleeing on the Senzon with Pino and some other commune survivors after a brief run-in with Raul. Along the way, Vincent learns that he is a proxy, Ergo Proxy, agent of death, and that his amnesia and mysterious dreams will slowly start to make sense, as it is revealed that he is a proxy who wiped its memories in order to stay sane and move on from his traumatic past. Eventually, he runs into Raul again, and the two affirm the goal of getting to Mosque so that Vincent can learn his past, and the two can understand the mystery of the proxy itself. Along the way, he grows more sure of himself, and even confesses feelings for Raul. Although this isn't a main aspect of the show, she seems to tolerate it, and eventually return feelings by the end of the series. Once the two make it to Mosque, Vincent is distraught to find nothing more than a ruined dome, and a room full of scribbles he can't read. He had hoped to find more, and a clear-cut answer to his questions, although he does get the answer that his fate lies in Ramdel. Now knowing this, him, Pino, and Raul once again board the Senzon and head home, to finally learn the truth of the proxy and the world around them. It is in burning Ramdel now, where Vincent and Raul finally learn the truth of Proxy 1, and Vincent's existence as the creator of Ramdel. It is said that Vincent was the proxy of Ramdel originally, and that he helped create the dome. He is the one that appointed Raul's grandfather as regent, in fact. He is the creator of all he sees, although he is a flawed creator, and for this reason left because he couldn't deal with both his flaws and the flaws of his creations. While initially distraught over all these revelations, Vincent steels himself in his newfound resolve and affirms that the past can't change who he is now, and that he must do what is right. As such, he confronts Proxy 1, who wants nothing more than to see humanity die off, and ends up killing him himself. Although not before the clone of Monad Proxy offers him a way out via, quote, heavenly light. While Vincent does see the opportunity presented here, he refuses, as he states that even if life is full of pain and negative experiences, it is also full of joy and pleasant experiences. As such, he must remain on Earth and stay with those he loves and continue growing into the best version of himself. The final shot of both Vincent and the show is Vincent standing tall, reflecting on who he is and his newfound desire to live. This leads us to looking at Vincent's character, and like Raul's, it is one full of growth, though in very different directions. For Vincent, his main growth lies in accepting himself and the truth. On the front of embracing himself, Vincent's growth here is very clear. He goes from an immigrant very obviously trying to repress his identity and individuality in an attempt to find acceptance in his new home, to an agent of death, trekking his own path and proud of who and what he is. While this trek is gradual, we can see it start from very early on, and it only accelerates as he masters his proxy powers and learns that his power can be used to protect in addition to destroy. Using his powers in this way greatly enhances his self-esteem as he protects Pino and later Raul. In fact, it is these two and their acceptance which help Vincent assert himself and end up accepting himself, as they provide support and drive to his quest. With Pino, Vincent serves as a sort of father, and the two are obviously close. Not only does this enhance Vincent's good guy image, but it also provides a sort of emotional support for him, showing him that, proxy or not, he is still a good being and worthy of respect. In Raul's case, while Vincent teaches her the power of compassion, she enhances his drive and keeps him moving. On the topic of this compassion, it should be noted that it is his compassion which in the end pushes Vincent past the goal line, pushes Vincent the furthest. While his quest is initially motivated by fear and panic, it is compassion which sustains him. It does this by enabling him to endear himself to the two who would ultimately help him see through his quest. If he was not the compassionate man that he was, it is doubtful he would have got the necessary support from either Pino or Raul. This compassion is also reflective of Vincent's role as a flawed creator. He's obviously very nice, but also initially very flawed, and this manifests in running away, and is only rectified with the help of others. Really, if one wants to think of it, Ergo Proxy can be seen as sort of a redemption quest, as Vincent finally comes to terms with his past, his running away, and who he really is. He finally accepts himself and finds the acceptance he craves, not by repressing who he is, but instead by embracing himself, and allowing others to embrace him as well. As such, by the conclusion of the series, he is self-assured and confident, and a man who has grown out of his timid shell he imposed upon himself to fit in. Vincent also learns to accept the truth, and this is another juxtaposition of Raul. Where Raul had strived to learn the truth constantly from the start, Vincent was initially hesitant to learn it, as he was aware that it may disturb him. Ultimately, though, Vincent learns he cannot run forever, and starts to embrace the learning process as well. As such, he goes on to accept that he is Ergo Proxy, and many other truths along the way. He accepts the fact that he needs to grow as a person, and that accepting the truth of the world is an important first step in this. As such, he learns to accept himself, and he also learns to accept the past. He accepts who he is and who he was and who he's done, although he firmly accepts himself, saying that the past doesn't matter as he lives in the present. He teaches us that true strength is not unlocked through physical power or monetary means or some other material measurement, but instead through oneself. Truly, the answers are within, and by learning what is within and growing and reflecting on these things, one can truly embrace who they are, their own true strength, and this can be unlocked and harnessed for further growth and development, for the good of everyone. This is shown by the fact that Vincent never actually unlocks any new strength or grows stronger, but simply instead learns to unlock what he already has, and in turn use it for the good of those around him and himself on his quest for truth. Finally, I'd like to touch on the aspects of Ergo Proxy itself. Now the word ergo means therefore, and is often known for being part of the phrase cogito ergo sum, which was said by Descartes and roughly means I think, therefore I am. A proxy is something which serves in the place of something else. So Ergo Proxy could be roughly translated as therefore something else, or therefore in place of, which, considering the material covered, is quite appropriate. Though I also want to mention that, hilariously, Dai Sato confirmed the name of the show was chosen simply because, quote, it sounded pretty cool. First though, I'd like to speculate that there's another aspect to this name, and that aspect is that it perhaps is a shout out to Friedrich Nietzsche, who, again, his philosophy was very influential on the production of this show and its writing, and Nietzsche always saw the phrase I think, therefore I am as an unprovable fallacy. So this would kind of be a fitting criticism of the line in line with what Nietzsche would think. Vincent also fits into the philosophy of Nietzsche in that he embodies the sort of new man that Nietzsche foresaw, or at least hoped for. a man who would ascend above the decaying morality of his day and the mediocrity of its society to hearken a new age. This person would be among the few strong enough to confront their own past and accept their mistakes, to fully grow into a strong person, to fully ascend to the highest form of humanity. This is a person who would help society overcome nihilism and set a new status quo for a new better age and a new better society. In the literal scope of the show, Vincent is often in place of Ergo Proxy, and Ergo Proxy is therefore Vincent, and Vincent Ergo Proxy. They are two different sides of the same coin, which connect to the original production idea of everyone having an alter ego. That's not to say Ergo Proxy himself is some kind of horrid monster or the exact opposite of Vincent. While not completely fleshed out, Ergo Proxy seems relatively sound of mind, though he can be quite morbid and brutal at times. His place as the Agent of Death may also seem a bit out of place, but I think it makes sense with context, and ultimately the plot of the show. Ergo Proxy's place is not to bring death in a literal sense, but to hearken the death of an age. In this case, this is the awakening. The thing that Ergo Proxy is killing is an era of stagnation and death. It is killing the era which humanity currently finds itself in. In this sense, Ergo Proxy's mission and position still benefit mankind and serve as a commentary on the need to always move forward. This also explains how the Agent of Death has such a strong will to live, and how Vincent can still serve as an excellent protagonist, as both he and his alter ego strive to kill the ignorance and hopelessness holding them back. They seek to kill death itself, and seek, of all things, to live, and affirm the will to live in humanity itself, and the beauty of life itself.
Now backtracking for a little bit, having discussed Vincent, that does lead us to a discussion about the topic of Gnosticism, seeing as that Vincent serves as a sort of Gnostic figure. This is a concept that Ergo Proxy runs with throughout the series, and it does lend a lot of unique flavor to it. Now to get this part started, we'll talk about is the place of Gnosticism in Ergo Proxy, and its implications for the show. Now the word Gnosticism traces its origins to the word gnosis, which means knowledge of spiritual mysteries. Now this references the ideas of hidden truths and forces which created existence, and the ideas of Gnosticism go back traditions millennia old. The bulk of these traditions state that there is a duality of the world, and this duality is split between the material world and the spiritual world. Now the spiritual realm is pure and clean, and was created by the highest creator, often referred to as the monad, while the flawed material world was created by an sometimes ignorant, sometimes malevolent lesser being, or lesser god if you will, often referred to as the demiurge. The idea that there is an existing hidden greater creator discoverable via enlightenment is also another key component of many Gnostic schools of thought. In many of these schools of thought, this is described as the monad, the greater god who created everything, while as mentioned earlier, the lesser creator is often referred to as the demiurge. While Gnosticism encompasses a wide range of schools of thought, some of which still existent and some of which no longer existent, and its origins are uncertain, there are some common elements, like the dualism mentioned above, and a sort of divine spark present in humanity, and the need for gnosis, or enlightenment, to reunite that spark with the monad. While I won't go into depth about the complex history and schools of thought of Gnosticism, I will say, for anyone wondering, no, Gnosticism is not inherently evil. It's not some kind of weird hidden cult or anything. It was a religious phenomenon dating back a long time ago, which simply had different interpretations of certain religious beliefs. In fact, before the consolidation of Christianity in around the 4th century, many Gnostic Christians were actually quite influential within the early Christian churches. Now, whether it originated from Judeo-Christian roots is still debated to this day. However, most schools of Gnosticism are not necessarily or explicitly anti-Christian or Abrahamic. They are simply different interpretations of it. Now, there are many interpretations, so I will leave it up to anyone to determine what these schools of thought are, or what place they have in one's own beliefs, but I just wanted to say, for anyone wondering, no, it's not necessarily inherently evil, or at least it was never intended to be. It's simply a very divergent and diverse group of thoughts which take on a view of the world which is simply different from current Abrahamic religious mainstream beliefs. And while it has historically clashed with them on some cases, it has also historically agreed with them in some cases. For example, many early Gnostic Christian sects still identified themselves as firmly Christian, holding up Jesus as the savior of the world. Gnosticism also seems to have had a very strong effect on the development of early Sufi Islam and Jewish mysticism. Again, while Gnosticism is not necessarily influential in many areas today, it has had lasting impacts on our religions of today, and it has also, in its many diverse schools of thought, trekked almost every boundary possible.
As such, its school's thoughts are too diverse to summarize even briefly, and while some may seem dismissive of monotheistic ideals in their entirety, or the current monotheistic religions of the world, others are simply different lenses with which to view these, and as mentioned earlier, Gnosticism is way too diverse to clearly classify it as a single unit. Each school of thought must be approached individually, and from there interpreted with one's own beliefs. With all of this in mind, it's pretty clear how Gnostic themes reflect in the series. Seemingly average people, Raul and Vincent, are caught in a hyper-material and flawed world, unaware of their true power and self, and soon voyage out to learn more about themselves and the nature of the world. Along the way, they slowly start to learn more and more, realizing that the seeming creators of this world, proxies, are nothing more than creations themselves, demiurges. While they have great power, they are not the be-all end-all, and the quest continues as Vincent and Raul learn that the answers they seek are within themselves. This, of course, is referencing enlightenment, upon self-reflection. Upon returning to where the quest started, and metaphorically themselves, they now know that there is in fact a higher level of creator after some reflection. Upon announcing this seemingly higher creator, Proxy 1, reveals itself, and this is where the interpretation can be taken one of two ways. The first would see Proxy 1 as a sort of monad. I mean, he did create Vincent, who did build Romdau, although this goes against the views that the monad is the highest creator and still benevolent. Now, Proxy 1 is obviously not benevolent, and he obviously hints that he was made by someone else. The other interpretation, and the one that the show seems to subscribe to, and that I subscribe to, is that Proxy 1 is simply a sort of higher demiurge, although still an imperfect and flawed creator and creation, either incredibly misguided or willingly malevolent. By interacting with this hidden being, Vincent learns the truth of himself and his purported purpose, his assigned role, although he goes against this and instead tries to purge the evil Proxy 1 from the world and establish his own path. Vincent, in turn, is offered escape, quote-unquote escape, by Monad Proxy into the, quote, divine light. Whether this is actual divine light or just sunlight isn't explicitly stated, although to me it seems it's just sunlight, and Monad Proxy is asking Vincent if he simply wants to quit existing. Now, Monad Proxy isn't truly enlightened or a monad herself, they just gave her this name for symbolic purposes. Anyways, knowing that this isn't the right thing to do, and that Monad Proxy is just another creation of man, Vincent declines and decides to stay on Earth to care for those he loves and continue his self-realization and quest for enlightenment, which is more important to him than whatever comfort he can seek from the, quote, easy way out. And this is what all true Gnostics would seek. They would seek the enlightenment that comes from within and from reflecting on the hidden mysteries of the world. Fittingly enough, the real symbolic monad is never revealed, and this can be interpreted as many things. Now, when I say real symbolic monad, I mean the one that created all the proxies. And what did create all these proxies could be interpreted as one of many things. The true monad could be the scientist that made them. It could be the divine force that created the humanity and therefore the scientists. Or perhaps this really is a Gnostic world and there's a force above that which created the divine force making man. The point here is that there's many different answers, although the show's pseudo-religious tones and atmosphere hint that there is something out there. As for its impact on the show, the Gnostic component has a very widespread effect on it. It's one of Ergo Proxy's most standout features, and lends a great deal to the somewhat mixed reception the show sometimes gets. This is because the show has a heavy emphasis on these ideals, and sometimes these may divert the, quote, logical train of thought present within the show sometimes. What I mean by this is that for some people it invalidates a lot of what happens throughout the show, like the Moss quest, and it makes the ending feel a little rushed. I don't believe this to be the case, though, as the trip to Mosque was still essential for what it provided the cast in terms of enlightenment along the way, and this is fitting with the Gnostic search for enlightenment through journeying. In addition, the atmosphere and tones of the show were hinting at something the whole time, so I'm glad that they did put something in there as opposed to simply just saying, oh, it was just atmosphere. Simply just having an unexplained air of mysticism or religious imagery. It greatly adds to the show in terms of aesthetics, and I think that the unique aesthetic of the show is one of its greatest strengths. It also ties into the ideas of the writers of the Ergo Proxy, who, though originally not intending to make a Gnostic work, ended up making one as their ideas and thought processes bled into the creative process. Now, I'm fine with this, as it is their work of art, and it's a very unique statement that the work of art makes. I'm also fine with it because it contributes to their own creative vision, which, again, is their own creative vision. I have no problem with this, and I enjoy the fact that they try to make the viewer explore such ideas that they may not have never heard of or thought of before. It gives Ergo Proxy its own unique flair. In terms of what it brings to the show in terms of content, I think it contributes well enough. As mentioned earlier, it does contribute significantly to justifying the odd pseudo-religious atmosphere and tones of the series, and it also validates the ending, which I don't know if it was originally written that abruptly because of production issues, but it works well enough.
and I'll give it a pass. Although I do understand how it does kind of come out of nowhere, it is also in line with their own ideals and the ideas practiced here, so it does make sense within the context of the Ergo Proxy universe. In addition, it doesn't invalidate the ending, which is Vincent and Raul and Pino going on to continue their family, which is all I really wanted. In the end, the show sticks to its message of pursuing the truth and looking within for answers, and these are ideals which are generally good for everyone, not just Gnostics, but they also just happen to be core components of Gnosticism itself.
Finally, with that topic discussed, and on the topic of searching for truth, that gets us to the main character of Raul Mayer.
And with the supporting cast examined, it's time we will look at Raul. In fact, she's just as important as Vincent, and the two's development together is a really good strength for the show. So what is this development, and what does she do? Now, Raul is introduced in episode 1 as an investigator working on a series of homicides which have just started around the dome of Ramdal. At first, thinking the murders must be the work of an infected autorev, she goes out to inspect one of the latest attack sites, but while investigating the site, is attacked by a proxy and witnesses claw marks that only a proxy could make. This, and the fact that Iggy says, quote, "Further examination will violate assigned protocols," let her know that something big is happening. In spite of this, though, she goes home for the night, where she is attacked and witnesses Ergo Proxy and Monad Proxy fight. This leaves her quite shaken, and from here, she insists on knowing the truth of what attacked her, and what lies beyond what she is told. Her suspicions are further heightened when she is told that she is simply having a mental breakdown caused by the stress of being stalked by Vincent, a man she knows too meek to do such a thing. She now knows that she's being lied to. Her instincts tell her she must meet Vincent in order to learn more. After committing to the bogus psychiatric exam required of her, she persists Daedalus to assist her for the time being, and eventually tracks down Vincent, only to watch him leap out of the air vent when Raul and the Security Bureau arrive. Determined, she follows him to the commune, only to fall sick and once again fail to bring him back. It is upon her return to Ramdo, though, that she is the victim of a failed assassination attempt, although she does use this to her advantage, and uses it to fake her death and sneak out of the dome once more, this time equipped with anti-proxy bullets made by Daedalus. She also promises to bring him a new proxy. From here, she and Iggy once again run into Vincent, and with the revelation that he is a proxy, they decide that they should continue together to Mosque to help unlock his past and the true nature of the proxy. This decision, however, sees Iggy, her autorev now with Cogito virus, snap though, and he attempts to forcefully bring Raul back to Ramdal. This plot is thwarted, however, when the autorev of a previously killed proxy attempts to blow up Raul, only to be carried away by Iggy, who is consumed in the blast. With Iggy reduced to but a malfunctioning head, Raul is forced to put him down. Her realizing that he had Cogito the whole time, and his rants about how selfish and inefficient she really is, start to open up her eyes about herself. From here, she journeys with Vincent and Pino to Mosque, and slowly warms up to both of them and grows as a person. In fact, Vincent even confesses feelings for her, which, while not focused on too much, seem to be returned by the end of the series. He also tells her to shoot him if he wanders too far from his moral ideals. On the way to Mosque, the group are stuck in a salt flat for a few weeks in episode 16, and it is here that Raul finally learns the values of others and of leisure. While she at first sees Vincent and Pino as complacent and a bit annoying, she eventually realizes that they are just enjoying human interaction, and that she needs to relax. From here, she is much more compassionate, and at Mosque even confronts a distraught Vincent, and agrees with him that their fate is in Ramdal. When they return to Ramdal, Raul goes about exploring the ruined dome and learning what happened. Finally, she ends up in the throne room and witnesses Vincent kill her grandfather, the man he appointed regent, and while she considers shooting him, is interrupted when Raul shoots Vincent instead. After this brief incident, the two discuss in the throne room about what is happening. It is here that Raul has a revelation. Vincent, seemingly distraught and having no idea what's going on or what to do, is interrupted when Raul proclaims that her truth has revealed the existence of a higher being. This is Proxy 1, of course, who opens the door for them, and she walks with Vincent to meet him, although she has to leave relatively quickly once Ramdal's self-destruct is activated by Daedalus. It is from here she talks to him one last time and escapes the burning dome. At the end of the series, she is rescued by Pino and smiles at the waiting Vincent. While Raul may not necessarily be the most complex character, she's arguably the one that grows the most. And this shows one of the hidden strengths of Ergo Proxy, with its surprisingly fleshed out character development. While one of the criticisms leveled at the show is that the main characters, and Raul especially, are unlikable, she's only a tad petulant at times early on, and this is obviously intentional. She's written to be a little insufferable at the beginning so that we can see her growth by the end of the series. It only furthers her evolution as a person. So how is she petulant? Well, at the beginning of the series, and to various extents up to episode 16, she always seems kind of bored, or self-centered, or irritable, or disappointed, or impatient, or cold, or a few other less than desirable traits. She comes off as a bit of a spoiled brat, and it is mentioned several times how she owes more to her status as the regent's granddaughter than anything else. She seems to place no real value on auto-revs, and always seems kind of annoyed, like everything around her is a waste of time. As time goes on, however, Raul learns the ability to empathize more, and more openly, and be more open, and to realize that not everything can or will be done immediately. The death of Iggy and her time with Vincent and Pino teach her that not all human interaction is bad or insufferable, and that human interactions have an inherent and undefinable value which must be treasured. This is her greatest takeaway from her journey, and the most important lesson she learns. She learns that humans are social creatures, and some organic interaction is needed to maintain both a healthy outlook on life and get through hard times. She learns that she cannot do everything alone or expect everyone to focus solely on her. She can't even do that. Initially, she has a stubbornly independent mindset with her at the center. While her quest for enlightenment is justified, her mindset is not, and this is gradually rectified as she becomes less selfish and learns the value of life and interactions. She initially sees Vincent as kind of a scrub, and Pino as a useless child, although ends up seeing Vincent as a man whose strength comes from his compassion, and Pino is basically her child. She has learned to treasure both of them, and life in general. She has learned that happiness lies more in how one approaches life than anything else. Her previous approach of focusing on what she doesn't have, what is in the way, and what isn't working, is slowly replaced by one valuing what she has, those people around her she has, what she has learned, and what she is capable of. She embraces self-improvement and growth, and ironically, though her journey is dangerous and harsh, it actually leaves her with a better and happier view of life, as she has come to appreciate her own efforts and the presence of those around her. She has learned the value of human interaction and self-improvement, all the while actually doing something productive, learning the mysteries of the proxy. By the end of the series, Raul is actually quite a pleasant and compassionate woman, valuing both Pino and Vincent and life itself. If anything, her quest and growth are another trumpet that the show uses to sing the praise for hard work and self-improvement. That's not to say Raul doesn't have some inherent good qualities either. While she starts with many bad qualities early on, she also starts with several positive qualities baked into her personality, and these qualities mature into excellent character strengths as the show goes on. These positive qualities are her calm nature, her logical abilities, her work ethic, and her desire to know. These are all traits which greatly assist her throughout the quest, and in turn evolve into her greatest strengths. Her calm nature and logical abilities assure that Raul always has some sort of plan, or at least doesn't panic when that plan seems to go awry. In fact, the few times she does panic are signs that something big is happening, and we need to pay attention to what that is. She helps Vincent stay on track, and her work ethic ensures that the quest for truth always stays on schedule. In fact, her interactions with Vincent are an excellent showing for both characters' strengths and weaknesses, and how they overcome them together. While Raul is driven and efficient, she's also cold and impatient. While Vincent is compassionate and patient, he's also scared and kind of needs someone to push him along. Thus, Raul keeps Vincent moving and on track, while her interactions with Vincent and Pino teach her to be more compassionate and patient, and help her generally reframe her view of life. They do, however, also grow in each other's positive traits, as they help refine each other's strengths. Vincent was patient before, but with Raul's help, patience now furnishes diligence in searching for the truth. With Raul, her work ethic at first manifested itself as somewhat of an impatient and pushy urge, although after episode 16, it starts to manifest itself more internally, and makes sure that she doesn't get discouraged from searching for the truth. This need to know, of course, is Raul's most defining trait, and one I would argue is good. It is, after all, what ends up driving the plot along, as if Raul's curiosity had not piqued in the first place, she never would have bothered to pursue Vincent, or start the chain of events which saw Ergo Proxy take place. Her presence and her focus-driven actions are clear testaments to her desire to know, and the importance of this desire. It is this kind of focus and burning desire to know which she also imparts on the audience, as she lets the audience in on the fact that even though we may not be aware of the world building of Ergo Proxy, we are aware that something is up in it, and it is something which we naturally find very curious. This also helps drive the plot along, as it means that she can serve both as an excellent source of exposition and as an excellent source of discovery, both for the cast and for those of us watching. For this reason, her curiosity and desire to know also tie into the Gnostic themes of Ergo Proxy. While Gnosticism will get a brief video of its own explaining its concepts and execution in the show, it should be noted that Raul is the character which embodies it the most. While she is not a literal manifestation of Gnostic principles, that would be more akin to say Vincent, she is the one which seems to embrace them the most by the end, because it is her that always proclaims a hidden truth, and in the end is rewarded by being shown the hidden truth. Her quest for enlightenment is actually validated at the end, and it is proven that there is a power beyond what she thought was initially there. Now, of course, this is Proxy 1, who ends up going down with Ramdao, but the point is the same. The point is that her quest for enlightenment and curiosity were validated, and that her pursuit of truth was something that ultimately helped her overcome both herself and many other obstacles in the way of her own character growth. While these were not necessarily direct products of finding out who Proxy 1 is, they were byproducts of them, and as such should be considered benefits of the quest for truth, and that the quest for truth's beneficial nature cannot be overstated.
While it does mean she gets reprimanded at work and doesn't have the most respect for established norms, it also means that she questions almost everything, and in the end grows quite a bit as a character and a person. She wants to know what she doesn't know for both herself and her own growth. She champions the idea that everyone should want to know and understand what's happening around them, in order to not only further their own growth, but the growth of society in general. As such, she ultimately champions personal growth as well. She is never content with not knowing, and as a result embarks on a quest for enlightenment, which ultimately reshapes who she is as a person into a much more mature, compassionate, and capable version. Her greatest message to the viewer is that while learning the truth may not always make you happy, it will help you grow the most, and ultimately shape your own fate and truth into a happy one.
With this comes another profound message from Ergo Proxy, and that message is the need to choose between a hard truth and an easy lie, and why one should always choose the hard truth. What I mean by this is that the idea of being honest with oneself and always striving to uncover the true nature of things benefits one more in the long run than simply trying to coast by or assume everything is alright when it is not. This is in opposition, of course, to denying, rationalizing, or playing down the current state of affairs in order to maintain some facade that all is well, and avoiding hard work and self-reflection. As Ergo Proxy and the highlighted examples will show, while this option is easy at first, it never yields long-term results, and is ultimately unsustainable. The three examples which I will provide to highlight this idea are the examples of the commune, the evolution of Vincent's self-view, and the nature of Raul's quest. Now, while there are of course more examples throughout the series, these are the examples which stood out to me the most. Let's begin with the tale of the commune, and its leader Hooty. Now Hooty is the leader of the commune, and a very interesting character, as he is simultaneously very wise and smart, and yet constantly lies to the commune and misleads the people around him. While he realistically knows that the commune has no realistic chance of readmission in the Ramdao, and he doesn't really question whether or not that would even be a good thing if it was possible, he leads the people of the commune into a sort of fake enthusiasm once Vincent arrives. Hooty knows that Ramdao doesn't really care for the commune, and with Vincent's arrival, will either continue to ignore it or destroy it. He instead convinces the people that Vincent is a guerrilla leader, and will lead a desperate Ramdao into surrendering to the commune's demands. While this is very obviously a bold-faced lie, the people buy into it, and Hooty continues to encourage this. He does this out of a sense of pity, thinking that the people of the commune are either doomed or fated to doom themselves anyways, so he might as well lull them into a sleep of sorts before they die. In his eyes, lying to those mostly helpless people is the ideal option, as at least they won't completely dread their life until its conclusion. He uses lies as a sort of painkiller. However, like any painkiller, it is obvious that these two are addictive, and destructive when overused. While Hooty intends to help the people of the commune by assuming the role of a wise leader, he instead facilitates their complacency, and ultimately the destruction of his own people, who for the most part are shown to either be delusional or stupid at this point. As for the consequences of this, they are not well either, as the only survivors of the commune are ultimately those that go with Quinn, actively denying the all is well narrative. And Hooty himself takes Raul back to Ramdao in a sort of redemptive sacrifice so Vincent can escape. In the end, his lies help no one, and in turn wasted up enough time to get everyone killed. Next is the case of Vincent Law, who evolves past his self-deception into an open acceptance of the facts on the ground. At the start of the series, Vincent represses every aspect of himself, and turns into a timid coward, all so that he could fit into Ramdao and become a model citizen. This sees him strip himself of a good deal of his own agency, self-esteem, and identity. This act of repression is of course against the backdrop of him wiping out his complete memory in order to escape a bad past. While he is clearly traumatized, and I won't hold that against him, I just wanted to point this out, as at the start Vincent has made every conscious effort to mentally run from what haunts him. His denial peaks as he jumps out of the airlock, trying to deny even life itself. As the series progresses though, Vincent slowly dials back his denial, first accepting that he is alive, then that he must look for his past, then that he is a proxy, then that he must return to Ramdao, and finally that he is who he is and must embrace it and continue living. He ends up finally accepting himself, and this spurs every bit of his character development, culminating in him embracing his own life, and refusing the chance to run offered by Monad Proxy. Vincent shows that hard work and looking for the truth pay off as he evolves into a much better version of himself. And this finally brings us to the evolution of Raul. Raul never runs from the truth, and instead always runs to it. While I don't want to repeat the previous points of how this inspired her journey, which saw her grow into the best version of herself, I do want to mention how dynamic it makes her. While Vincent takes time to grow into himself and embrace his agency, Raul, seeking the truth, does so from the very start. She's among the most dynamic of the cast, and her dynamicism basically sparks the entire series. It is of course also rewarded, as she learns the truth of Ramdal right before escaping to live her new life with the people she has grown close to along the way. Now I bring up Raul in this case because she was the only character that chose truth from the start. She chose the hard path from the start, and although this was a harder path, it was for the most part clearer, as she had a defined objective throughout most of it. That defined objective, of course, was find Vincent, help him get the mosque, and then learn what you can figure out from there. This just goes to show that although finding the truth and looking for it may not be the easiest path, it's generally one which will kind of structure itself. Now these three cases show that the dangers of taking the easy lie are numerous, and that the power of seeking the truth as commented by Ergo Proxy is quite strong and productive. Udi and the Commune show how completely taking the easy way out ultimately destroys one's own life. Vincent shows that choosing the hard truth isn't always easy, but it is rewarding. And Raul shows that openly embracing the hunt for the truth can truly empower oneself. With that, it's time to wrap things up, as I feel that I've touched on all I've wanted to, and stated why I think Ergo Proxy is really a beautiful story about the strength of humanity and its rebirth even through the toughest of times.
This retrospective has examined the characters of Ergo Proxy, which I felt needed to be examined the most. Now, as there are many moving pieces in the series, there's also a lot of background characters, which kind of fell under the radar, but at the same time I felt didn't really have the kind of character development or impact beyond a few plot points necessary to really justify them being talked about. To gloss over these characters, these are Proxy 1, who serves as more of a concept than a character, and is kind of hidden until the very last episode. I know he makes like cameo appearances in other episodes, but he really only talks or does stuff in the last episode. A Monad Proxy, which again was more of a concept and lacked development, served more to offer Vincent an easy way out in the final episode and prove how weird and creepy Daedalus was getting. Christiva, that's Raul's auto rev, who again doesn't necessarily have too much of a character of her own. She, goes to work, does the job, serves her purpose, and makes the audience question stuff a little. She ends up joining the family in the last episode too. I don't think I've mentioned that yet. But again, doesn't really do too much other than kind of assist Raul in his duties and later become Pino's kind of godmother, I guess. Iggy, who I feel is just a kind of smaller version of Daedalus in that he encompasses the show's message of reason d'etre and the flaws of having someone assign it to you, because he's like, oh, I was assigned Raul, everything is based on Raul, and then we can see that he becomes obsessive about it, and that's not good, and it slowly destroys him. And I feel like that's the commentary there, and that was kind of touched on the Daedalus episode. As for his character itself, I find it kind of annoying, to be honest. I mean, I guess I feel bad for him, because, Raul never really valued him as a being, and it is his death which kind of gets her to reconsider her views on auto revs. So he is important in that regard, but in terms of his actual characters at the show, not much development, not much is done. It's basically a commentary on raison d'etre, as Daedalus is, so I didn't comment on his character. Many of the proxies, they're pretty cool, but again, they're just kind of like one episode characters who serve a plot purpose, and they kind of just, you're defeated or left behind or something. So I feel like none of these characters really justify their own dedicated video. Maybe later I could make a one-off video, a lightning round kind of all these characters. Now, Ergo Proxy is also a show with a lot of philosophical concepts and productions, so I understand that I might have glossed over a few of those as well. I might not have gone over everything that there is in this show. Although, again, I feel like I commented on the major ones that the show was getting about. Gnosticism, Nihilism, the purpose of being, finding your own purpose, and general condition of the human state and ability to overcome adversity, which I feel like were the main themes that the show was talking on. It's very interesting talking about these two in the Ergo Proxy retrospective, especially because unlike other stories like, say, Trigun or The Big O, which I felt were at their core character stories, Ergo Proxy seems more of a concept story, and it's very interesting just kind of noting the differences in tone and appearance and writing that kind of brings to the table as opposed to if it's a character-centered story. Again,
The messages are a lot the same, and a lot of the characters in Ergo Proxy are actually very well written and fleshed out. It just feels like they are to support ideas as opposed to convey ideas. I mean, they do convey the ideas, but it just feels like Ergo Proxy is not necessarily a character story, which is not a detriment of it. It's just a different kind of story, and I thought that was very interesting looking at it, because I did feel a difference. I don't know if someone else would feel it just watching the series, but I did feel a sort of difference there. On the core points of the series and the retrospective, though, I feel like I got everything, and I feel like I talked about all the big stuff. These points, of course, are the main messages of the series, which I feel came quite clearly to me. These messages are, of course, that one can never give up, one has to look for the truth and answers within, strive for a better life, or at the very least, just continue getting by. Because if given a chance, life will find a way, and that's a beautiful thing, and I feel like that's really the core message of Ergo Proxy. And a beautiful thing is also how I would describe Ergo Proxy as a series. It's quite beautiful, both literally and figuratively. In a literal sense, its unique aesthetic, combining futuristic elements and old-world elements with a pseudo-religious tone, blend the creative world, which is supposedly dead, yet still yearns and succeeds to express itself, and has its own very unique air. It simultaneously feels very scientific, and yet very religious and reverent. In a figurative sense, the beauty of the show is even more apparent, though, as it's a tale of the beauty of life. As noted earlier, while the series may seem bleak on the surface and often gets dismissed as such, it really isn't. In fact, I found it quite uplifting the second time I watched it, as it proclaims that the human condition is still one felt by many, and that it can always improve even in the bleakest of times. While its commentary on nihilism may be a little highbrow, and the Gnostic elements above that, the series never came off as pretentious to me. Except for episode 20, I kinda hated it, to be honest. But other than that, I feel like the pretentious reputation the series has is not necessarily warranted, and I don't think you should turn away from it because you've heard it's pretentious. Like I've said, you don't need to get every detail down. That's another thing that people say about the show, that you need to note literally everything. No, you might have to rewatch a couple scenes a few times, but I don't think that you need to take hardcore detailed notes to really get to the core of what they're saying. Because, the story itself is relatively simple if you boil it down to the main point, which is that life will go on, because humanity can and will often get past whatever obstacles will hold it back with enough effort. And this gets to my point where I feel that even though I didn't understand everything they were talking about, or all the highbrow concepts, I still felt I understood the key messages at the very core of the series, which, no matter how delivered, are still inspiring. For this reason, I love Ergo Proxy, and I think it is a masterpiece to be held up high, even if it is a little too highbrow for its own good every now and again. However, because the highbrow elements of this are kind of a stylistic choice, they don't really impact the core message or enjoyability to the show, at least to me. In fact, upon rewatching the series, I went into it not trying to completely parse everything, and instead just letting the key information come to me and sift through my brain, and simply try to enjoy the big picture. As mentioned in the introduction, I watched this as you would ride a wave. I didn't fight it, I just let whatever come to me, and then go from there. And rewatching it this way, I found it actually a lot more enjoyable. I remember the first time I watched this, I paused everything a lot, I rewatched a lot of stuff, and I looked a bunch of stuff up to see, get to know what they were thinking about, and that would lead to higher brow concepts, which, while I eventually understood, I felt that kind of bogged down the series, looking everything up. Watching it like a wave, though, I found that the series' main messages came to me anyways, and even if a lot of the higher stuff, went over my head, that did not impact the main conclusion, that did not impact the main messages, and I found it enthralling. I do stand by this, and I do stand by that Ergo Proxy is a great anime, and that one you should watch. Again, if you don't understand everything, that's okay. I didn't completely understand everything, and I feel like that might even be part of the appeal of it. It kind of adds a Lovecraftian, not understanding element to the series, which is kind of cool. If you do want to understand everything, of course, feel free to look everything up, although I didn't do that the second time because I feel personally that bogged everything down. Although regardless, I will say that this series is a masterpiece, and it is one which should be looked upon very highly. I in fact find myself liking it quite a bit more than the first time I watched it, and upon rewatching it, I'm happy to be able to appreciate the core story, and the beauty of it, and its message. And while Ergo Proxy may seem forgotten sometimes, or it may seem it tells of a world that's forgotten, it really is, to some at least, something of an obscure memory, and a great obscure anime memory. Now for some housekeeping stuff. First off, a big thank you to everyone who watches these, as I find nothing more uplifting than putting a smile on someone's face with my ramblings. I thank all of you who have watched my videos, and all of those who have subscribed especially. And, it is really fulfilling doing these and, having people enjoy my hobby and my work. So anyways, thank you for watching this, and finally, thank you
for helping me remember and relive some great, obscure anime memories.